The first thing Lady Lydia Penrose noticed was not the whispering, nor the screen placed between her chair and the better families, nor even the Duke of Caldermere standing beneath the vestry window, with his jaw set like a judgment already delivered. It was the empty space on the pew rent board where 3 names had been rubbed away so thoroughly that the wood looked wounded. Kent, spring of 1849, had come softly to Caldermere parish, with primroses showing along the churchyard wall and damp green moss clinging to the old stones. Yet inside the vestry there was nothing soft at all. The room was narrow, panelled in dark oak, and crowded with the sort of people who could turn charity into a performance of rank. The rector sat beside the churchwarden with a subscription book open before him. A silver poor box rested on the table. Folded lists of promised donations lay beneath a paperweight shaped like a lamb. Near the hearth stood Lady Letitia Arundel, pale, graceful, and exact in pale blue silk, speaking in a voice that never rose above gentleness and therefore never had to answer for cruelty. Lydia had been placed behind the folding screen, close enough to hear every word and far enough away to be reminded that she had been invited as a courtesy, not included as an equal. Her chair was beside the poor box table. Someone had done it deliberately. She knew because her name card had been written in the rector's own hand, then moved. The faint line of dust, where it first rested, remained near the main table. Lydia did not look at it twice. She had been trained by reduced circumstances, family obligation, and too many polite exclusions to notice injury. Without giving it the satisfaction of spectacle, in her gloved hand, hidden beneath the fold of her shawl, she held a cracked brass alms token no larger than a half-crown. It had belonged to her Aunt Aurelia Penrose, whose old letters had smelled of lavender, ink, and candle smoke, and whose last instruction to Lydia had been simple. Remember the women no one sees. Lydia had not understood then. Now, looking at the pew rent board mounted crookedly near the vestry cupboard, she began to. The board listed families with paid pews, parish officers, reserved benches, and charitable seats. The carved lines were old, dark with varnish, and crowded with names. Yet beneath the lower row, where the almshouse widows should have been listed, 3 pale smears interrupted the pattern. They were too deliberate to be wear, too clean to be age. Lydia leaned forward. Behind the screen, her movement made the smallest rasp against the floorboards. Lady Letitia paused. Several ladies looked around as if a servant had dropped a spoon. Lady Lydia, Letitia said with a smile, "How diligent you are. I'm afraid the parish accounts are not arranged for general amusement." A few soft laughs followed, small as pins and almost as sharp. Lydia lifted her eyes. Across the room, Emrys Cull, Duke of Caldermere, turned his head. He was taller than she remembered from London, though perhaps it was not height but stillness that gave that impression. His black coat fit without ornament. His face was handsome in the severe way of old portraits, all restraint, bone, and command. He looked like a man accustomed to doors opening before he reached them, and conversations altering shape before they touched him. At that moment, he was not looking at her as a man looked at a woman. He was looking at her as an interruption. The rector cleared his throat. "We are discussing the subscription for the almshouse roof. Lady Lydia, it is generous of you to attend." Generous of you to attend meant unnecessary for you to speak. Lydia's fingers closed more tightly around the cracked token. "I beg your pardon, Reverend Marsh," she said, her voice calm enough to make several people listen despite themselves. "I was looking at the pew rent board. The Duke's brows drew together. The pew rent board? Yes, Your Grace. Lydia rose because to remain seated behind the screen while pointing out a falsehood would make the falsehood stronger. Her dark green gown was plain, well brushed, and 2 seasons out of fashion. She knew every eye that registered it. She stepped from behind the screen and crossed the vestry without haste. The floor creaked once under her shoe. At the board, she lifted one hand but did not touch the wood. There are 3 names missing from the almshouse row. The rector blinked. Names are often altered over time. Altered, yes. Removed, certainly, but not erased so cleanly from beneath varnish that the lower grain shows newer than the surrounding field. Silence pressed at the room's edges. Lady Letitia's fan opened with a soft snap. My dear Lady Lydia, perhaps Thorn-lee customs have confused you. Parish order can be difficult for those who have not been involved in its proper management. Thorn-lee, the name entered the room like a draught under a closed door. Lydia did not react, though she felt the token cut lightly into her palm through the glove. Thorn-lee Court had not yet been publicly named as hers. The final papers were to be acknowledged the next morning, after Mr. Fincham had reviewed one last enclosure. If Letitia knew to mention it now, someone had spoken before he should have. The Duke's expression hardened. He had already been displeased when the meeting began. Lydia had heard enough, even from behind a screen, to understand why. Some unknown purchaser had acquired Thorn-lee Court, the old estate bordering Caldermere Park. A lady, someone had whispered, a lady without visible fortune. A lady who had moved quietly through solicitors, instead of asking permission from the county's great house. Lydia turned slightly toward Emrys, not with defiance, but with the steadiness she used when entering rooms where no chair had been meant for her. The missing names may matter to the almshouse subscription. Your Grace, if the charitable seats were reassigned, or if the widows were moved without record, then the roof repairs may not be the only concern. A murmur rose at once. The churchwarden shifted. Letitia lowered her gaze as if embarrassed for Lydia. The rector looked at the Duke, and that small movement told Lydia everything about the parish. Here even charity waited for rank to decide whether truth was inconvenient. Emrys Calder stepped away from the window. Light from the high panes caught one side of his face and left the other in shadow. Lady Lydia, he said, this is not the occasion for speculation. No, Your Grace, it is the occasion for subscription. That is why records attached to the almshouse should be correct. Something flickered in his eyes. Not admiration, not yet. Irritation sharpened by the uncomfortable possibility that she might be right. You have recently taken an interest in property matters, I understand. Letitia's lashes lifted. The room listened harder. Lydia kept her breathing even. I have taken an interest in accuracy. Accuracy, he repeated. And do you suppose that stepping from behind a screen to correct the rector, the churchwarden, and the parish patron is the proper expression of it? Heat rose beneath Lydia's collar, but it did not reach her voice. She had endured sharper humiliation from people with less power and fewer witnesses. If a name has been wrongly removed, Your Grace, the improper act occurred before I stood up. The words struck the room. They were not loud, but they made silence. The Duke's mouth tightened. He was a man who had perhaps been contradicted often in Parliament, rarely in a parish vestry, and almost never by a woman seated beside the poor box. Lady Letitia took one step toward him, as if offering rescue from impropriety. Lady Lydia means well, I'm sure. One must allow for nervous enthusiasm in ladies whose circumstances have not given them much occupation. Lydia felt that, not because it was true, but because Letitia had shaped the insult like pity, and pity was harder to refuse in public. Emrys did not look at Letitia. He looked only at Lydia. "Enough," he said quietly. Quietly was worse. The room obeyed it at once. "This parish has managed its duties for generations. You are a guest here. You have neither office nor authority in this vestry." Lydia held herself still. She could hear a coal settling in the grate. She could hear the rector's breath catch and release. She could feel the cracked brass token pressing into the lifeline of her palm. The Duke's next words fell cleanly, each one polished by rank. "Know your place, Lady Lydia." No one laughed. That would have been kinder. Laughter would have made the cruelty common. Instead, the vestry gave her the terrible compliment of silence. Letitia's fan stopped moving. The rector looked down. The churchwarden examined his inkstand. Lydia felt the screen behind her, like the shape of what they expected her to return to. A hidden chair, a lowered head, a polite apology that would let everyone call the matter settled. She thought of Aunt Aurelia's handwriting, slanted and firm. "Remember the women no one sees." Then Lydia did the one thing no one in the room expected. She smiled. Not warmly, not sweetly, merely enough to show she had understood the command and declined to be broken by it. She lowered herself into a curtsy so exact that even Letitia could not fault its depth. It was the curtsy of a lady who knew every rule well enough to leave by them. "Then I shall go and stand in it, Your Grace." She straightened. For the first time since he had entered the room, the Duke of Caldermere looked uncertain. It lasted no more than a breath, but Lydia saw it. So did he. She turned to the rector. "Good afternoon, Reverend Marsh." To the churchwarden, "Mr. Bell." To Letitia, with the same controlled courtesy, "Lady Letitia." Then she walked past the subscription book, past the poor box, past the screen that had failed to keep her invisible, and out into the church porch. No one stopped her. That, too, was an answer. Outside, the air smelled of wet grass, old stone, and the faint sweetness of spring flowers growing where no one had planted them. Lydia's carriage waited beyond the leach gate. She crossed the churchyard without haste, though her heart beat hard enough to hurt. Behind her, inside the vestry, voices did not resume. The silence followed her down the path like a witness. Only when she reached the carriage did she open her hand. The cracked brass alms token lay warm against her glove. Its edge had left a crescent mark in the fabric. On one side, worn almost smooth by years of touch, were the initials AP. On the other, beneath a line of tarnish, 3 tiny notches had been cut into the rim. Lydia had always thought them damage. Now she wondered whether they had been counted there, one for each woman erased, one for each stolen place. The footman opened the carriage door, but she did not step in at once. She turned back toward the church. Through the vestry window, partly clouded by old glass, she saw the Duke standing exactly where she had left him. He was no longer speaking. His gaze had followed her, not with triumph, not with dismissal, with attention. For one dangerous instant, their eyes met through the uneven pane. Lydia closed her fingers around the token again and climbed into the carriage. As the wheels began to turn, she looked down at the brass in her palm and spoke so softly that only the empty seat opposite could hear. "Aunt Aurelia, what place did they take from you?" By 9 o'clock the next morning, Lady Lydia Penrose had learned that humiliation did not always fade with sleep. Sometimes it sharpened. It woke before the maid drew the curtains. It sat beside the breakfast tray and made the tea taste of metal. It followed her into the small hired carriage that took her from the modest lodging she had kept near Caldermere village to the market town where Mr. Abel Fincham maintained his office above a stationer's shop. Yet it did not bend her. If anything, the memory of the vestry had settled inside her like a line drawn in ink. Mr. Fincham was waiting. When she arrived, a narrow gentleman with silver spectacles, careful hands, and the grave expression of a man who had spent 30 years preventing families from calling greed by prettier names. He bowed without surprise, though his clerk glanced at the dust on Lydia's hem and then quickly looked away. "Lady Lydia," Fincham said, closing the door to his private room, "you received my note." "I did." Lydia removed her gloves, folded them once, and set them beside the leather folder on his desk. The cracked brass alms token lay in her reticule, close enough that she could feel its weight whenever she moved. "You wrote that the final acknowledgement was ready. It is." He placed one hand on the folder, not yet opening it. "Before you sign, I must ask whether Sir Vernon has approached you since yesterday." Lydia stilled. "No." "Why?" Fincham's mouth compressed. "Because he called here before I arrived this morning. He left no card, but my junior clerk recognized him. Sir Vernon wished to know whether the Thorn-lee papers had been transferred into your personal keeping." "And what did your clerk tell him?" "That clerks who answer questions about a client's property soon become clerks looking for employment elsewhere." Lydia might have smiled if she had not been so cold. "Thank you, Mr. Fincham. Do not thank me yet." Fincham opened the folder and drew out several sheets, each arranged with quiet precision. "The purchase of Thorn-lee Court is complete. The vendor's solicitor has acknowledged receipt. The deed is properly engrossed. Your aunt's legacy, after the sale of certain securities, has covered the agreed sum and necessary fees. There remains enough for immediate repairs, though not enough for extravagance." "I never wanted extravagance." "No," he said, studying her over his spectacles. "I had gathered that. What you have acquired, Lady Lydia, is not a fashionable toy. Thorn-lee is old, underkept, and inconveniently placed beside a very powerful neighbour." He paused. "It also carries parish obligations that previous hands have treated carelessly." Lydia thought of the pew rent board and the 3 pale scars where names had been erased. Almshouse obligations. Fincham's fingers stopped on the paper. It was a small movement. A lesser observer might have missed it. "What makes you ask?" "Yesterday, in the Caldermere vestry, I saw 3 names rubbed from the charitable seats. Which names? I could not read them clearly, only the absence." Fincham leaned back, and the chair creaked under the shift of his weight. "Your aunt was troubled by the almshouses before her death." "You did not tell me that. I had no proof, only references in her letters." Miss Aurelia Penrose was cautious, especially near the end. She believed someone had altered parish records after certain widow rooms fell vacant. "Fell vacant," Lydia repeated. The phrase tasted false. That was the term used. Fincham's gaze lowered to the deed. "Sir Vernon urged you to decline the property because he said it would burden you. I advised you otherwise because your aunt did not leave you funds merely to make you comfortable. She left you a responsibility." Lydia took the pen when he offered it. Her hand did not tremble. There were moments when life invited a woman to remain reasonable, grateful, and small. Then there were moments when reason itself demanded courage. She signed her name in full. Lady Lydia Penrose. The ink shone wetly for a breath, then began to darken. Fincham sanded it, waited, and turned the page. The original deed will remain in secure custody until all counterpart documents are indexed. You will receive certified copies this afternoon. I recommend that no relative, however concerned, be permitted to hold them. Sir Vernon is not my guardian, no, but he has often behaved as if repetition could create authority. Lydia looked toward the window. Below, a boy in an apron swept dust from the stationer's step. Across the street, two ladies paused beneath the awning of a milliner and bent their heads together as Lydia's carriage waited in plain view. News travelled through a market town faster than any official notice. By luncheon, half the parish would know. By dinner, Caldermere Park would know. Perhaps it already did. "Mr. Fincham," she said, "when my aunt gave me the brass token, she told me to remember the women no one sees." Fincham's expression changed. "Not much. Enough. You still have it." Lydia opened her reticule and laid the cracked token on the desk between them. The old brass looked humble against the legal papers, but Fincham regarded it with more attention than he had given the deed. "There are 3 notches," Lydia said. "I thought they were damage." Fincham did not touch it. Miss Aurelia had a habit of marking things when she feared written records might fail. What did she mark? That is what we must discover. For the first time that morning, Lydia felt something stronger than hurt. Not peace, not victory. Direction. She returned the token to her reticule, accepted the sealed packet Fincham prepared for her, and rose. "Then I shall begin at Thorn-lee." Fincham bowed. "Begin with the housekeeper. Old houses remember through women long before they remember through papers." An hour later, as Lydia's hired carriage turned through the neglected stone pillars of Thorn-lee Court, she understood what Fincham meant. The estate did not welcome her with grandeur. It received her with silence, ivy, and a gravel sweep furred with weeds. The house stood long and grey beneath a roof that had lost more slates than dignity. One wing was shuttered. A cracked urn leaned near the steps, yet the bones of the place were graceful, and the land beyond the paddock rolled toward a line of beech trees that marked the boundary with Caldermere Park. There, beyond distance and rank and yesterday's wound, rode a solitary figure on a dark horse. Even before the groom at the gate murmured the name, Lydia knew. The Duke of Caldermere had come to the ridge. He did not approach. He did not call out. He simply reined in and looked across the land that, until yesterday, had been a matter of inconvenience to him, and, from that morning onward, belonged to the woman he had dismissed before witnesses. Lydia stepped down from the carriage without allowing herself to glance away. The wind caught the edge of her bonnet ribbon. The sealed packet from Fincham rested in her left hand. Her right hand held the reticule with the token inside. For a long moment, Thorn-lee Court lay between them. Like a sentence, neither had yet learned how to finish. Emrys Calder sat very still in the saddle. From this distance, she could not read his face, but she could feel the force of his attention. It was different from the vestry. There, he had looked at her as interruption. Now he looked as though a fact had rearranged itself against his will. Lydia turned from him first, not in retreat, but because this was not his threshold. The front door opened before she reached it. A thin, older woman in a black gown and white cap stood just inside, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles showed. "Lady Lydia?" "Yes, Mrs. Vale, my lady. Housekeeper, though there's little enough house kept of late." Her voice was dry, but her eyes were wet. "Miss Aurelia said you'd come if the place ever found its way to you." Lydia stopped on the threshold. "You knew my aunt?" Everyone who needed kindness knew Miss Aurelia. Mrs. Vale stepped back, allowing Lydia to enter. The hall smelled of dust, cold ashes, beeswax long spent, and something faintly herbal beneath it all, as if lavender had once been stored in the linen press and refused to leave. Dust sheets covered the chairs. Portraits had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls. Sunlight entered through high windows and revealed more neglect than comfort. Lydia should have felt disappointment. Instead, she felt an almost unbearable tenderness. A neglected house was not a dead house. It was a waiting one. "There are papers I must inspect," she said. "Parish papers, if any remain here. Anything connected to the almshouses." Mrs. Vale's hands tightened further. "Then you'd best see the old mantel first." She led Lydia into a small parlour where the hearth was cold and the mirror above it had gone cloudy at the edges. Behind a loose side panel beneath the mantelshelf, Mrs. Vale drew out a narrow wooden string fitted with old brass hooks. Most were empty. At one end hung several parish tokens, dull with age. At the other end were 3 clear gaps where metal had once rested long enough to leave clean circles in the dust. Lydia took one step closer. Her breath left her quietly. She opened her reticule, removed Aunt Aurelia's cracked token, and held it beside the first empty place. It matched, not perfectly, because it had been handled for years, warmed by Lydia's palm, and carried through grief, insult, and resolve. But the shape was the same. The old hook fitted through the worn hole at the top. Lydia placed the token there. It made a tiny sound as it settled against the wood. Small, final. Mrs. Vale covered her mouth. "There should be 3, Lydia said. "Yes, my lady." "Whose were they?" Housekeeper looked toward the shuttered window, toward the church beyond the trees, toward a history that had apparently frightened even the loyal. Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Bell. They had rooms by right, Miss Aurelia said. Then after she died, the parish called the rooms vacant. Lydia looked at the 2 remaining gaps. Outside, somewhere beyond the glass, a horse moved on the ridge, but she did not turn to see whether the Duke still watched. Her place was here now, in the dust, among missing names, before a string of tokens that had waited longer than she had known. She touched the cracked brass once, gently, then let her hand fall. "Then we shall find the other 2. On the 5th morning after the vestry meeting, Lady Lydia Penrose stood in the Thorn-lee morning room with 3 ledgers open on the table, one housekeeper watching the door, and the distinct sensation that someone had tried very hard to make an old estate forget itself. The room had been swept since her arrival, though the corners still held grey ribbons of dust and the windows still looked out through a film of neglect. Mrs. Vale had brought what papers she could find from the butler's pantry, the linen press, and a locked drawer under the still-room shelves. They were not enough. There were household accounts from years, when the west roof had leaked, gardener's notes about boundary hedges, and a list of pew payments written in a hand that changed abruptly after Aunt Aurelia's death. There were no proper almshouse leases, no complete widow allowances, no explanation for why Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, and Mrs. Bell had been rubbed from the parish board as if their names had embarrassed the wood. Lydia turned one brittle page with the back of her finger. This entry says 2 shillings were carried forward for Widow Cole in November, but the next page begins in January. Mrs. Vale stood near the sideboard, hands folded at her waist. December was cut out, my lady. Lydia looked closer. The torn edge near the binding was too neat to be accidental. Not lost. No, my lady. The housekeeper's voice lowered. Removed. Before Lydia could answer, wheels sounded on the gravel sweep. They were not the loose rattle of a tradesman's cart or the softer roll of Mr. Fincham's gig. These wheels came with harness polish, matched horses, and authority. Mrs. Vale crossed to the window, moved the curtain no more than an inch, and went still. The Duke of Caldermere. Lydia felt the room contract around the name. She had expected him eventually. Men like Emrys Calder did not leave unsettled facts on neighboring land. Still, expectation did not prevent the quick tightening beneath her ribs. She closed the ledger, not because she wished to hide it, but because she would not be caught bending over it like a girl discovered in mischief. "Show his grace in, Mrs. Vale. Leave the door open." "Yes, my lady." A few minutes later, Emrys Calder entered the morning room in a dark riding coat still marked faintly with mist from the park. He removed his hat at once. His gaze moved over the room. The ledgers, the opened shutters, Mrs. Vale stationed just beyond the threshold, and finally Lydia. If he remembered the last time he had seen her from the ridge, standing before a house that had become hers, he did not say so. He bowed. "Lady Lydia." "Your Grace." She curtsied with perfect correctness. Not deep enough to surrender ground, not shallow enough to be rude. His eyes registered the balance. "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." "That depends upon the purpose of your call." A pause touched the air. He deserved the reply, and by the faint change in his mouth, he knew it. "I have come to discuss neighboring responsibilities." Responsibilities are always welcome. Supervision is less so. Mrs. Vale looked down very quickly. The Duke did not. "Then I shall endeavor to be precise." He stepped no farther into the room until Lydia indicated the chair opposite her. That small restraint, almost invisible, unsettled her more than command would have done. Command she understood. Courtesy from a man who had publicly humiliated her was harder to place. He sat only after she did. "Thorn-lee borders Caldermere Park along the eastern beach line," he said. "There have been drainage disputes in wet years. Several tenant paths cross between the properties. The parish claims certain dues through the old Almshouse Foundation. I would know whether you intend to maintain previous arrangements." "Which previous arrangements?" "The recognized ones." Lydia folded her hands on the table. "Your Grace, I have been mistress of Thorn-lee for 3 days. In that time, I have found a token string with 3 missing alms tokens, a pew rent board with 3 erased widow names, and an account ledger with December cut out. I am not yet convinced the recognized arrangements deserve preservation." His attention sharpened. "You believe the almshouse records were altered." "I believe records do not remove their own pages." "That is not proof." "No, it is a beginning." The words settled between them. Lydia expected rebuke. Instead, he looked at the closed ledger beneath her hand. "What do you know of the almshouse leases?" "Enough to know they were not ordinary charity rooms. If my aunt's notes are accurate, they appear to have been connected to a small endowment, partly supported by Thorn-lee rents and partly by parish subscription. The widows were not meant to be moved at the convenience of whoever wished to tidy the accounts." For the first time, surprise broke through his discipline. "You have read tithe commutation tables. I have read what governed the income of a house I was expected to inherit, and almost persuaded to refuse. By Sir Vernon Locksley, among others." The Duke's gaze lifted from the ledger to her face. It was not soft, it was not warm, but it was no longer dismissive. "He told me yesterday that Thorn-lee was too burdensome for a lady." Lydia's voice remained even. "Sir Vernon has always been generous in discovering burdens I might avoid if I gave him authority over them." A sound came from the hall, not a servant's step. a cane striking boards with the confidence of someone who had entered many houses without waiting to be wanted. Mrs. Vale appeared in the doorway, pale with irritation. "Sir Vernon Locksley, my lady. He says the matter is urgent." Lydia did not look away from the Duke. How interesting. The morning grows crowded with concern. Emrys rose. Lydia rose as well, because she would not receive one man seated while another stood over her. Sir Vernon entered before Mrs. Vale could properly announce him. He was a well-fed man in his 40s, handsome in a heavy way, with silver-threaded hair, a mourning ring too large for sincerity, and an expression polished by years of calling interference devotion. "My dear Lydia," he said, "I came the moment I heard His Grace had called. I feared you might be overwhelmed. By a morning call? By property discussion." His smile included the Duke and dismissed Lydia at the same time. "She is very earnest, Your Grace, but old papers can be treacherous." Lydia has always had a habit of reading feeling into ink. Lydia heard Mrs. Vale's indrawn breath. She felt, rather than saw, Emrys turn his head. "Have I?" she asked. Sir Vernon came closer to the table. "You know I speak from affection. Your dear aunt filled your head with causes. It was charming when you were younger. But estate management requires steadier judgment. These ledgers should have been sent to me first. They are Thorn-lee ledgers. And you are new to Thorn-lee. I am also its owner." The word fell quietly. It did not need volume. Sir Vernon's smile thinned. "A legal fact, yes. But not every legal fact is a practical competence. Your Grace will understand. A woman may hold property and still require guidance." Emrys said nothing. That silence might once have frightened Lydia. Now it angered her. She reached for the top ledger. Sir Vernon moved at the same moment and placed his hand over her sleeve just above the elbow. The pressure was not dramatic. It was worse. Familiar, correcting, intimate in the way control becomes when practiced too long under the name of family. "Be sensible," he murmured. "Don't perform independence before a duke." Lydia's body stiffened before she could prevent it. Her chin lifted. "Remove your hand." Sir Vernon's fingers did not move at once. "Lydia, don't be childish." The room changed. It was not the opening of a door or the raising of a voice. It was the Duke of Caldermere becoming entirely still. His gaze had dropped to Sir Vernon's hand on Lydia's arm, then to the controlled line of her shoulders, then back to the man who had mistaken quietness for permission. "Sir Vernon?" Emrys said. The tone was low enough to be almost courteous. "Lady Lydia has answered." Sir Vernon released her. The movement was quick, but not quick enough to erase what had been seen. Lydia kept her arm at her side. She would not rub the place. She would not give either man the sight of discomfort, though the imprint of Vernon's grip seemed to remain through sleeve, skin, and memory. "There is no need for misunderstanding," Sir Vernon said, colour rising under his collar. "I have managed matters for the family for years." "That is becoming increasingly clear," Lydia replied. Vernon looked at her then with a flash of something naked and cold. It vanished almost at once beneath offended dignity. "You will regret making enemies of those who wished only to spare you embarrassment." "I was embarrassed in the vestry," Lydia said. "It did not kill me." Emrys's eyes moved to her face. She did not look at him. Sir Vernon bowed with poor grace, muttered something about returning when she was calmer, and left the room with his cane, striking harder than before. Mrs. Vale remained by the door until the front hall closed around him. Only then did the Duke speak. "Did he hurt you?" Lydia turned one page of the ledger with care. "He reminded me." "Of what?" "That concern is sometimes only command wearing gloves." Emrys absorbed that in silence. She could feel him wanting to say something. An apology, perhaps. A defense. Another instruction. Instead, he looked at the cupboard beside the chimney-piece, where Mrs. Vale had earlier found the lock newly fitted. You said old papers were missing. Not missing. Inaccessible. May I see? The question mattered. Lydia disliked that it mattered. She crossed to the cupboard and showed him the new brass lock. Its shine offended the old wood around it. Emrys bent slightly, not touching it. Recent, he said. Within a month, perhaps less. Sir Vernon had access before I arrived. And now he does not. For a moment they stood close enough, before the locked cupboard, that Lydia could smell rain on his coat and leather from his gloves. No touch passed between them. Nothing improper, yet awareness entered the space, all the same, sharp and unwelcome. He could have reached past her. He did not. He stepped back first. I shall send no steward here without your leave, he said. But if parish papers have been altered under Caldermere patronage, I have a duty to know. Lydia met his eyes. You have a duty to know. I have a duty not to be silenced while you learn. A faint shadow crossed his face. I deserved that. Yes, Your Grace, you did. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it left something open. Not forgiveness, not trust, a door no wider than a crack in old panelling. Emrys bowed. Then I will wait to be told what assistance you authorize. He left soon after, and Lydia watched from the morning room window as he rode away toward the beach line. Only when the sound of hooves had faded did Mrs. Vale return from the hall, holding something small in her palm. My lady, she said, voice tight. While Sir Vernon was here, I checked the passage cupboard. The key to that new lock is gone. Lydia looked at the brass lock on the parish folio cupboard, then at the ledgers on the table, then at the empty places in the token string beyond the parlour door. The house was speaking. At last, she was beginning to hear where it had been forced silent. By the 7th morning, after the vestry humiliation, the old pew-rent board lay across 2 trestles in the Thorn-lee servants' hall, and Lady Lydia Penrose could see, even before the carpenter lifted his lamp, that the wood had been made to lie. The board had been brought from Caldermere parish, under the rector's reluctant permission, the churchwarden's anxious stare, and the Duke of Caldermere's written instruction that it was to be preserved from further handling until examined. Lydia had not asked the Duke for that instruction. She had sent word to the rector through Mr. Fincham, naming the erased row and requesting a witnessed removal. The Duke's note had arrived before the rector could refuse. That fact unsettled her, though she did not let it soften her caution. Men with power often helped best when they were embarrassed enough to do so. The carpenter, Mr. Lobb, was a square-handed man with a patient squint and a reverence for old joinery. He bent close, holding the lamp low. There's varnish over the rubbing, my lady. See there? Newer than the rest. Mrs. Vale stood near the door with her arms folded, as if guarding not only the board, but every erased woman it might name. Can you read what was under it? Lydia asked Mr. Lobb took a strip of fine linen, breathed lightly on the wood, and rubbed no harder than one might touch a sleeping child. Letters rose slowly beneath the clouded sheen. Not fully, not enough for the careless. Enough for Lydia, who had spent years learning to read what families and parishes preferred hidden. Pike, she said. The name struck the room with the force of a bell no one else could hear. Mr. Lobb shifted the lamp. Here's another beginning with H. Lydia leaned closer. Harrow. Her heart beat once, hard. And the last. The old varnish gleamed. A faint upward struels at the end. Mrs. Vale whispered before Lydia could. Bell, there they were, Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Bell, 3 women reduced to pale scars on parish wood, 3 empty places on Aunt Aurelia's token string, 3 lives converted by someone into absence. Lydia placed one hand flat on the table beside the board, not touching the evidence, close enough to steady herself. "Mark nothing yet," she said. "We need Mr. Fincham to see it before any treatment changes the surface." "Wise," said a voice from the open doorway. Lydia turned. Emrys Calder stood just beyond the threshold, hat in hand, rain-dark hair touched by the morning mist. He had not entered unannounced. Mrs. Vale's lifted chin suggested she had made him wait until Lydia's permission could be asked. He bowed. "Forgive the intrusion. Reverend Marsh informed me the board had been removed. As parish patron, I thought it necessary to see that the peace was properly preserved." Lydia glanced at the board. "It is being preserved. So I observe." His gaze moved from the trestles to her face, and there it rested a little longer than etiquette required. Not rudely, not boldly, with the same attention she had seen through the vestry window after she left him standing in silence. "May I come in?" The question touched the air between them. Mrs. Vale noticed it. So did Lydia. A duke asking permission to enter a servant's hall in a neighboring estate was not ordinary behavior. It did not erase what he had said in the vestry, but it stood near the wound without pretending the wound was not there. "You may," Lydia said. Emrys stepped inside and remained at a respectful distance from the board until she indicated the near end of the trestle. "Mr. Lobb has found the names," she said. "Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, and Mrs. Bell." The Duke's face did not change quickly, but the stillness in him altered. It became less defensive, more intent. Those names should be on the charitable pew row. They were. Lydia looked down at the rubbed places. Then someone decided the parish would look tidier without them. Mr. Lobb cleared his throat. "There's more, my lady." "Begging your grace's pardon." Emrys inclined his head. The carpenter ran one blunt finger along the back edge of the board without disturbing the face. Old nail holes here and here, then a second set lower down. Boards been taken off and put back. Not recent as this varnish, but not ancient either. 5 years, maybe 6. Could be after Miss Penrose died, if that's the question. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes briefly. Lydia did not. 5 or 6 years. Aunt Aurelia had died almost 5 years before. "It is the question," Lydia said. "Then someone removed the board after my aunt's death, erased the names, varnished the row, and rehung it." Emrys looked at the second nail holes. That would require access to the vestry, or permission from someone who had it. His eyes lifted. "You suspect, Sir Vernon. I suspect any person who benefits when widows vanish from accounts. That is not a denial. No, your grace. It isn't." For a breath, his mouth almost moved. Not amusement. Something closer to recognition. Lydia looked away first. It was safer to look at wood than at a man learning, too late to listen. Mr. Lobb shifted the board slightly to inspect the lower edge. One trestle wobbled. The board slid. Lydia reached for it at the same instant Emrys did. Their hands met on the dark oak. His fingers closed around the edge. Strong and controlled. Her fingertips brushed the back of his glove, then the bare line where leather gave way near his wrist. The contact was brief, entirely accidental, yet it made the room go impossibly quiet. Lydia felt warmth rise beneath her collar, swift and unwelcome. She did not snatch her hand away like a frightened girl. She withdrew it with deliberate calm once the board was steady. Emrys did the same a heartbeat later. "Thank you," she said, because courtesy was safer than silence. "The board was falling," he replied. The words were plain, but his voice had changed. It had lost its edge. Mr. Lobb suddenly became fascinated by the trestle peg. Mrs. Vale looked toward the window with the firm restraint of a woman who had seen many things and would comment on none of them. Lydia folded her hands before her. The board should remain here until Mr. Fincham arrives. Agreed. Emrys looked at the erased names again. It should not return to the vestry until a proper copy is made and witnessed. A proper copy of the damage, Your Grace, or of the truth beneath it. He accepted the correction without flinching. Of both. That answer troubled her more than resistance would have. She had prepared herself to fight arrogance. She had not prepared herself for adjustment. Emrys turned from the board to her. Lady Lydia, I owe you an apology for the vestry. Mrs. Vale went very still. Mr. Lobb froze with a peg in his hand. Lydia's pulse became unhelpfully loud. Do you? She asked. Yes. He drew a breath. I spoke sharply and without sufficient knowledge. It was a careful apology, well made and insufficient. Lydia knew the shape of such things. Gentlemen offered them when facts became inconvenient, not always when conscience became awake. You spoke publicly, she said, and you were publicly wrong. A shadow crossed his face. Yes, then a private apology is tidy, Your Grace. It is not complete. He looked at her as if she had placed a hand against the machinery of his life and stopped one gear. You are right. She had not expected that. It left her with no immediate answer. He looked back to the board, to the three names emerging from beneath polite erasure. What happened in that vestry should not have happened. Which part? Lydia asked quietly. Your words to me, or the missing women? Emrys was silent. Outside, rain ticked against the windows. At last he said, Both. But I think you knew of one before I was willing to see the other. The honesty was not tender. It did not ask for forgiveness. It stood between them, plain and uncomfortable. Lydia respected uncomfortable truths more than polished apologies. My aunt used to say, records fail only when people want them to, she said. Yesterday I thought she had left me a house. Now I think she left me an unfinished duty. And you mean to finish it. I mean to discover whether 3 women lost rooms that were theirs by right. I mean to know why their tokens were removed from Thorn-lee and their names from Parish Wood. I mean to learn why Sir Vernon appears wherever the papers should be. The Duke's gaze sharpened at the name. He came here again, not since the morning you saw him, but his absence has not made him less present. Emrys glanced toward the hall cupboard, where the newly fitted lock still guarded the missing parish folios. If he holds the key, he may return for what is inside. Then he will find Thorn-lee less obliging than before. Something almost warm touched Emrys's expression. It vanished quickly, but not before Lydia saw it. I begin to believe Thorn-lee has found a mistress suited to it. The words struck more deeply than flattery would have, because they did not praise her appearance, her compliance, or her usefulness to a man. They acknowledged competence. Lydia felt the danger in that too. A wound could make any recognition feel like sunlight. She would not mistake sunlight for shelter. Thorn-lee and I are both under examination, she said. You may reserve judgment. I have done too much judging already. Again, honesty. Again, not enough to absolve, but enough to disturb. Mr. Lobb finished wedging the trestle and announced too loudly that the board would not shift again. The moment broke. Emrys stepped away from the evidence. I will send a note to Reverend Marsh. The board is not to be reinstalled until you and Mr. Fincham authorize its return. Lydia lifted her chin. Until Mr. Fincham and I authorize its return. Yes, he said at once. Until Mr. Fincham and you authorize it. The correction mattered. He knew it mattered. Mrs. Vale's mouth softened almost imperceptibly. Lydia walked with the Duke as far as the servants' hall threshold, no farther. Rain had silvered the gravel beyond the open front door. His horse waited under the beech, held by a groom. Before leaving, Emrys turned back. "Lady Lydia, your grace, the line you spoke earlier, about place being stolen without moving a stone." She waited. "I did not understand it in the vestry." His eyes held hers. "I am beginning to." It was the first thing he had said that sounded less like a duke and more like a man faced with the ruin of his certainty. Lydia did not forgive him. She did not thank him. She only inclined her head. "Then perhaps the board is not the only thing that has begun to show what lies beneath the varnish." He looked at her for one still second, then bowed and left. Only after the sound of hooves faded did Mr. Lobb call from the servants' hall, "My lady, there's one more mark on the back." Lydia returned at once. The carpenter held the lamp low over a shallow scratch near the lower rail. Not a name, a small carved cross, almost hidden under dirt. Mrs. Vale inhaled sharply. Miss Aurelia's mark. Lydia reached for the cracked brass token at her reticule, then stopped before touching it. She had placed it back on Thorn-lee's token string, where it belonged for now. The object was not in her hand. It was in the parlor, hanging in the first empty place. She remembered this and let her fingers fall. "She saw the board after it was changed," Lydia said. Her voice was calm, but the room seemed to tilt toward the words. "And she marked it before she died," Mrs. Vale whispered. Then she knew. Lydia looked at the erased names, the second nail holes, the old cross cut by a dying woman who had trusted memory when records failed. "Yes," she said, "and now so do we." The printed notice arrived at Thorn-lee just after dusk, folded once, sealed with cheap red wax, and pushed beneath the front door as if even the messenger had been ashamed to knock. Mrs. Vale found it on the hall tiles while Lydia was in the parlor, standing before Aunt Aurelia's old token string and studying the first cracked brass token where it hung in the empty place she had restored to it. The pew-rent board remained in the servants' hall under cloth, its erased names witnessed by Mr. Lobb, Mrs. Vale, the Duke of Caldermere, and soon Mr. Fincham. Yet proof had a way of feeling fragile before it became public. Lydia heard the housekeeper's step pause outside the parlor and knew, before a word was spoken, that something unpleasant had entered the house. "My lady." Mrs. Vale held out the paper with 2 fingers. No hand, no proper seal, left like rubbish. Lydia took it. The wax cracked beneath her thumb. The sheet inside was poorly printed, the letters uneven, as though the printer had been paid in haste and conscience. "Beware those who purchase land to purchase influence. Certain ladies, newly raised by inheritance and old grievances, now disturb parish peace by stirring widows against lawful officers and respectable families. Charity must not become a stage for revenge." Lydia read it once, then again. Nothing in it named her, which made it more dangerous. A named accusation could be answered. A fog could enter every room. Mrs. Vale's lips had gone white. That is Lady Letitia's tone, even if it is not her hand. "It is someone's convenience," Lydia said. She folded the notice carefully and placed it beside Fincham's packet on the table. Her voice remained even, but a coldness had opened inside her, and it means we are near enough to something for them to be afraid. The next morning, Lydia went to find Mrs. Pike. She did not go alone. She took Mrs. Vale in the carriage, sent a note to Mr. Fincham naming her destination, and informed the Duke of Caldermere through a brief message that she intended to speak with one of the erased widows. She had not asked his permission. She had informed him because dangerous people disliked witnesses. The widow's cottage stood beyond the parish edge, where the lane dipped toward a ditch full of reeds, and the hedges grew ragged from neglect. It was the sort of place society called humble when it wished to avoid saying damp, poor, and forgotten. Smoke leaned weakly from the chimney. A broken pan rested beneath a leak in the thatch. Mrs. Pike opened the door, only a hand's width at first. She was small, bent by years rather than age, with work-reddened fingers and wary eyes that went first to Lydia's face, then to Mrs. veil behind her. "I've paid what was asked," she said before Lydia could speak. "If there's another paper, I can't read it without my spectacles." Lydia felt that sentence strike deeper than any insult in a vestry. "Mrs. Pike, I have not come to collect anything from you." The door did not widen. "Then why's a lady from Thorn-lee at my step?" "Because your name was erased from the pew rent board." Mrs. Pike's face changed. Fear moved through it first, then grief, then the hard discipline of someone who had survived by denying both. "There's many Pike families." "Your name was beside Mrs. Harrow and Mrs. Bell. I found one alms token at Thorn-lee. Mrs. Vale believes it belonged to my aunt's almshouse charity." A sound came from the lane, horse tack. A carriage wheel. Lydia turned, already prepared to resent interference. But the Duke of Caldermere had not come in a carriage, and had not ridden up to the cottage door. He stood at the lane's bend beside his horse, hat in hand, far enough away to avoid forcing his presence upon the cottage, near enough to be seen if trouble came. He had received her message then. He had chosen distance. Mrs. Pike saw him and shrank back. Lydia's anger flashed hot, not at the widow, at the world that had taught her to fear rank even when it stood still. "His Grace will not enter unless you invite him," Lydia said. "Nor will I if you prefer to speak here." Mrs. Pike looked from Lydia to the Duke, then to Mrs. Vale, whose eyes had filled with old recognition. "You were little when Miss Aurelia came with broth," Mrs. Pike whispered to the housekeeper. "Not so little I forgot who she fed when others counted coal," Mrs. Vale replied. The door opened wider. Inside, the cottage smelled of peat smoke, damp wool, and rosemary hung to dry. Lydia did not sit until Mrs. Pike did. She kept her gloves on and her hands folded, resisting the urge to reach for the woman's hand before trust had been given. Outside the small window, Emrys remained near the stile, turned slightly away, as though even his gaze had asked leave. "Mrs. Pike," Lydia said gently, "I need to know whether you once had a room in the Thorn-lee almshouses." The widow stared at the fire. "My husband worked the south meadow until his lungs failed. Miss Aurelia said I was to have the end room. It had a window toward the church path. I remember because she said morning light belonged to widows as much as brides." Lydia's throat tightened. "What happened after my aunt died?" "Sir Vernon's clerk came. Do you remember his name?" "Mr. Cray, thin gentleman, ink on his cuffs. He said the rooms were under correction, and the tokens must be collected for proper marking. He said, if I made difficulty, my nephew's tenancy might be reconsidered." Mrs. Pike rose slowly, crossed to a shelf behind a chipped jug, and drew out a square of cloth. "I shouldn't have kept it, but Miss Aurelia said never surrender all proof at once." She unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a brass alms token, worn but whole, its surface dark with age. It was not Lydia's cracked token. It was the second. Mrs. Vale pressed a hand to her mouth. Lydia did not touch the token. "Mrs. Pike, you may keep it until you choose otherwise." "I don't want it hidden here any more," the widow said, voice shaking. "Hidden things make a person smaller every year." She pushed it across the table. Lydia received it with both hands. as if it were silver plate before a queen. Then I will hold it as your witness, not as your possession surrendered. Mrs. Pike nodded once. Tears did not fall. Her dignity would not permit them yet. Mrs. Harrow kept hers longer than any of us. Then she was sent away. Canterbury, I heard, under another name. Lydia wrapped the token in the cloth again. And Mrs. Bell, dead 2 winters past. She died in a room she paid rent for, after they told her the almshouse had never been promised. The cottage seemed to lose air. Outside, the Duke turned at the sound of Lydia rising, but did not come closer. She stepped back into the lane with Mrs. Vale and the wrapped token in her hand. The ground near the stile was slick from last night's rain. Emrys moved then, only a step, and offered his arm. Not command, not assumption. Merely an offer held in silence. Lydia looked at the muddy rise, then at him. For the first few steps, she walked unaided, because her balance was her own, and she needed him to know it. At the stile, where the boards were wet and uneven, she placed her gloved fingers lightly on his sleeve. His arm steadied beneath her hand, firm and still. He did not cover her fingers. He did not guide more than she permitted. They crossed together without a word. Only when her feet were secure on the lane did she release him. "Thank you," she said. "You chose the moment," he replied. The answer unsettled her with its quiet precision. For a short distance they walked side by side, while Mrs. Vale followed with Mrs. Pike's blessing folded in her silence. Emrys looked back at the cottage. "I promised, before you came out, that no widow on Caldermere land would be removed while this inquiry continues." Lydia stopped. "You spoke to her?" "From the lane. She asked whether I had come to take her roof. I told her no." He drew a breath, and for the first time his voice carried something rougher than pride. "It appears my house has been blind in places where blindness was useful to others." Lydia watched him carefully. "Useful to others, yes. Comfortable for your house, perhaps." He accepted the blow. "Perhaps." Wind moved through the hedge. It stirred the paper notice Lydia had brought folded in her reticule, the printed accusation already trying to make compassion look like vanity. She looked toward Thorn-lee beyond the rise. "They will say I am using these women." "Yes," Emrys said. "No false comfort, no pretty denial. They will. And you," he met her eyes. "I saw Mrs. Pike look at that token as if it were the last honest thing left to her. No, Lady Lydia, I don't think you're using her." The words were not a declaration. They were not even enough, but they were the first belief he had offered before a room forced him to do it. Lydia looked away before the warmth of that could betray her. "Then we must find Mrs. Harrow." As the carriage carried her back to Thorn-lee, the second token lay wrapped beside Fincham's packet, and Lydia understood that the printed notice had failed in one respect. It had meant to frighten her from the path. Instead, it had shown her exactly where the path led. That evening, just as Mrs. Vale lit the hall lamp, another paper arrived by hand, this time addressed in an elegant slanted script. Lydia did not know. It read, "Lady Lydia Penrose would do well to remember that disturbing parish peace may have consequences beyond her own reputation." Lydia folded it once and placed it with the first notice. Then she looked toward the parlor, where one cracked token hung on the old string, and one wrapped token waited beside it. 2 places had begun to speak. The third was still missing. The splinter entered Lady Lydia Penrose's palm so cleanly that for one foolish second she did not feel pain at all. She only saw the tiny dark line beneath her skin, caught there like an accusation that had found flesh after failing to remain hidden in wood. The pew rent board had been moved from the servants' hall to the old estate office at Thorn-lee, where the light was better and Mr. Abel Fincham could lay his papers without fear of kitchen traffic or rain blowing under the rear door. The board rested on baize-covered trestles. Beside it lay the first printed notice, the second elegant threat, Mrs. Pike's rapt token, and Fincham's neat copies of the subscription receipts. Lydia had meant only to lift the corner of the board while Mr. Lobb checked the lower rail again. A ragged edge under the frame caught the seam of her glove, pierced through and bit into the base of her palm. She drew back at once. A bead of red appeared against the torn kid leather. Mrs. Vale made a small sound. Mr. Lobb cursed softly, then apologized to every lady present, living and dead. Fincham reached for his handkerchief, but Emrys Calder was nearer. He stopped before he touched her. The stillness was immediate and complete. Lydia looked up. The Duke of Caldermere had removed his gloves to examine the old nail holes, and one bare hand was already half extended. He lowered it at once. "May I?" he asked. The question was quiet. It held no assumption, no command, no attempt to make usefulness into ownership. Lydia could have refused. She knew he would let her. That knowledge was its own danger. Trust sometimes began not with grand gestures, but with a space left open for refusal. She opened her injured hand. Yes. Emrys took the clean linen Fincham offered, but he did not take her hand until she placed it palm upward between them. His fingers were warm, careful, and steady. He bent over the small cut with the concentration of a man examining an oath. The splinter came free on the edge of the linen. Lydia felt the sting then and kept her breath slow. He noticed anyway. "I'm sorry," he said. "It is a splinter, Your Grace, not a duel wound." "I know." His mouth tightened faintly. "That doesn't mean it should be dismissed." The answer moved through her more sharply than the cut. Around them, the room had become politely occupied with anything else. Fincham sorted receipts. Mr. Lobb inspected a hinge that required no inspection. Mrs. Vale stared at the window with the fierce dignity of a chaperone who would witness propriety into existence by will alone. Emrys folded the linen once and pressed it lightly over Lydia's palm. "Hold it there for a moment." She curled her fingers around it, and his hand withdrew before closeness could become confusion. He had touched only as much as she allowed. No more. Lydia looked at the small white square against her palm. "You are learning restraint with alarming speed." His eyes lifted to hers. "I had cause to learn." That was all. No polished apology, no rehearsal of guilt. The words were low enough that only she could hear them, and because they asked for nothing, she let them remain. Fincham cleared his throat, rescuing them both. "Lady Lydia, the receipts from 1844 through 1848 are inconsistent. The parish subscription book records payments for almshouse roof repairs in 3 separate installments, yet Thorn-lee's estate disbursements show no matching labor charge, no slate purchase, and no payment to a mason." Lydia turned back to the table. Duty steadied her faster than linen. Could the parish have paid tradesmen directly? "It could have," Fincham replied, "if the tradesman existed." He lifted 2 receipts. "Mr. Hobb of Ashford denies this signature." Mr. Vale, the late Thatcher, had been dead 7 months when this account was supposedly settled. The 3rd receipt bears the mark of a firm that repairs chapel glass, not roofs. Mrs. Vale crossed herself under her breath, and the almshouse roof still leaks. "Precisely." Fincham placed the papers side by side. Money was collected. Work was recorded. Work was not done. Emrys stood very still beside the table. The old pride had not vanished from him, but it had changed shape. It no longer stood between him and the truth. It stood under the weight of it. Who signed the approvals? Fincham pushed one page forward. The churchwarden, under parish authority, and here countersigned as family adviser to the Thorn-lee interest, Sir Vernon Locksley. Lydia had expected the name. It struck nevertheless. Some betrayals became heavier once paper held them. He told Mrs. Pike the rooms were under correction, she said. He told me I misread old papers, said Mrs. Vale. He told the county. Emrys said, his voice controlled, that Lady Lydia's new interest in widows was an attempt to stir sympathy against established parish officers. Lydia's head turned. The county? The Duke's face hardened. Lady Letitia repeated it yesterday at Caldermere Park in front of my mother and 2 visiting families. She called it distressing. She said, compassion becomes dangerous when joined to wounded pride. Lydia felt the words settle like soot. There it was. The printed notice now had a drawing-room voice. And what did you say? Emrys did not look away. Not enough. The honesty came quickly this time. It still hurt. I said no conclusion should be drawn while an inquiry was underway. Lydia folded the linen tighter around her palm. That is safer than saying, I am not using old women for revenge. Yes, his jaw tightened. It was safer. Fincham looked down at his papers. Mrs. Vale looked at Lydia. Lydia kept her voice level because she had learned long ago that anger given too freely became entertainment for those who caused it. Safety has a habit of seating itself in the best pew. Emrys took the rebuke without defense. Then I will say more next time. Next time may come before you are ready. I begin to understand that readiness is a luxury rank often mistakes for prudence. That silenced her, not because it healed the wound, but because it named part of it accurately. Mr. Lobb, eager to return the room to wood and nails, announced that the board should not be handled further until he could brace the splintered underside. Fincham gathered the receipts and tied them with blue tape. Lydia looked at the packet, the injured board, the 2 threats, and the wrapped second token from Mrs. Pike. Evidence was assembling itself, but so was danger. I want to see the unused almshouse rooms, she said. Fincham's brows rose. Today. Emrys turned toward her. Allow me to send my steward first. If the rooms are unsafe, he can report on the condition before you enter. Lydia's palm stung beneath the linen. She held his gaze. That is not accompaniment. That is replacement. I meant only to spare you risk. People have been sparing me knowledge for years. The words came sharper than she intended, but not sharper than truth. Mrs. Pike was spared her room. Mrs. Bell was spared her right to die under a roof promised to her. My aunt was perhaps spared the pleasure of being believed before death. No, Your Grace, I will see the rooms myself. Emrys's expression shifted. The old version of him would have issued a decision and called it care. This man, standing in a shabby estate office with her blood on a square of linen he had asked permission to apply, stopped himself. She saw the effort. It mattered because effort was the only proof change could offer before habit returned. Then I will accompany you if you authorize it, he said, as witness, not commander. Lydia heard Mrs. Vale's breath leave her. Fincham's pen paused over his note. Outside, wind moved through the wet beech leaves, and somewhere in the house an old shutter tapped once against its frame. Lydia looked down at her bandaged palm. Then at the receipts, then at the Duke. You may come, she said. Mr. Fincham will come, Mrs. Vale will come, Mr. Lobb will wait outside until we know whether boards or ceilings are unsound. Emrys inclined his head. As you decide. The unused almshouse rooms stood beyond the kitchen garden, joined to Thorn-lee's old charitable wing by a covered passage choked with ivy. They were smaller than Lydia expected and colder than any room meant for mercy should have been. The first had a cracked basin, a narrow bedstead without rope, and a window patched with paper. The second smelled of damp plaster. The third, the end room Mrs. Pike had described, faced the church path. Morning light should have entered there. Instead, the shutters had been nailed nearly closed. Lydia stood in the center of it and imagined a widow told she had surrendered this place voluntarily. She imagined Aunt Aurelia promising morning light. Her throat tightened. Emrys remained near the threshold, not crowding the room. The roof was never repaired, he said. No. Lydia crossed to the wall beside the cold hearth. A strip of paneling sat unevenly, its edge lifted just enough to catch shadow. Her injured hand protested as she pressed near it, so she used the other. The panel shifted. Something brittle slid down behind it with a dry whisper. Fincham stepped forward. Lydia reached into the gap and drew out a narrow scrap of folded vellum, stiff with age, its lower edge torn as if it had once belonged to a larger document. The ink was faded, but Aunt Aurelia's small cross marked the corner. No one spoke. Lydia unfolded it with care. Only a few words were visible. 3 rooms, permanent use. Widows of Thorn-lee Parish. Fincham's face lost colour. Emrys looked from the vellum to Lydia, and the force of his attention was almost a touch. "You were right," he said. Lydia held the torn piece in her uninjured hand, feeling the cold room, the nailed shutters, the weight of widows made invisible by ink and fear. "No," she answered softly. "My aunt was." By the morning of the church restoration fete, Lady Lydia Penrose had learned that charity could be arranged like a battlefield, with flowers on the tables, music near the porch, and every weapon hidden beneath smiles. Caldermere parish had dressed itself for virtue. Garlands of spring greenery looped around the churchyard gate. A painted model of the almshouses stood beneath a striped awning, its tiny windows clean, its miniature roof perfectly repaired in a way the real roof had not been for years. Ladies in pale gowns moved between donation tables with baskets of ribbons, lavender sachets, and printed cards requesting subscriptions for the continued comfort of deserving widows. The word deserving appeared 3 times on the largest placard. Lydia saw it and felt the small wrapped shapes in her reticule grow heavier. Before leaving Thorn-lee, she had taken Aunt Aurelia's cracked brass arms token down from the old token string and placed it in a square of linen, separate from Mrs. Pike's second token, which remained locked with Mr. Fincham's packet at Thorn-lee. Lydia had brought the cracked token because it bore Aunt Aurelia's initials and the 3 notches on its rim. She had meant to show it only to Reverend Marsh. If he could be persuaded to examine the erased board evidence after the fete. Now, looking at the arrangement of faces near the donation table, she understood that others had made plans for it first. Lady Laetitia Arundel stood beside the almshouse model in rose-coloured silk, receiving coins into a porcelain dish as though Grace itself had appointed her treasurer. Her smile warmed when Lydia approached. That was the first warning. Sir Vernon Locksley stood near the churchwarden with one hand tucked into his coat, speaking in a low voice that made the older man frown toward Lydia before pretending not to. That was the second. The third was Mrs. Pike, seated near the edge of the gathering in a plain black bonnet, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles strained the fabric. Lydia had not expected her to come. Their eyes met across the churchyard. Mrs. Pike's lips trembled, but she gave the smallest nod. Courage, Lydia thought, often looked less like a raised banner than a frightened woman deciding not to stay home. Lady Lydia, Letitia called, making the name carry just far enough. How kind of you to join us. We were not certain whether Thorn-lee's affairs would keep you occupied. Lydia stopped beside the donation table. Widows' rooms are Thorn-lee affairs, Lady Letitia. A few heads turned. Letitia lowered her lashes in sympathetic alarm. Of course. I only meant that your new responsibilities must be considerable. One does worry when grief and inheritance place a lady under sudden strain. I am not strained. No? How fortunate. Letitia touched the porcelain dish. Then, perhaps you will not object to a little clarity. Sir Vernon stepped forward before Lydia could answer. His face wore the expression of a man regretfully performing duty before witnesses. My dear Lydia, no one wishes to distress you. The words moved through the watching group like honey over a blade. Lydia looked at him steadily. Then, you are about to do something distressing, and hope to be praised for reluctance. The rector coughed. Letitia's smile flickered. At the far side of the churchyard, Emrys Calder, Duke of Caldermere, turned from his mother's side. Duchess Agnes, erect and silver-haired beneath a black bonnet, followed his gaze. Emrys began walking toward the donation table, not hurriedly, but with enough purpose that the gentleman near him parted without being asked. Lydia felt his approach before he reached her. She did not turn to him. This was not his wound to enter first. Sir Vernon drew a folded receipt from his coat. This was brought to my attention by a parish officer concerned for propriety. It records the collection of charitable tokens from the displaced almshouse women for safekeeping and correction. Yet I am told one such token is now in your possession. A murmur rose, delicate and delighted. Lydia felt the ground alter beneath her. I have a token that belonged to my aunt. Do you? Vernon's sadness deepened. Or have you persuaded an elderly widow to surrender parish property so you might dramatize your claim against respectable officers? Mrs. Pike made a small sound. No one heard it except Lydia. Letitia lifted one hand to her throat. Sir Vernon, surely Lady Lydia would not take advantage of women who are frightened and dependent. It must be a misunderstanding. The cruelty was perfect because it came dressed as rescue. Lydia's pulse slowed. That sometimes happened when danger became clear. She saw the path they had laid. If she denied having the token, they would call her false. If she produced it, they would call her thief. If she spoke of Mrs. Pike, they would say she had coached the poor. If she stayed silent, the silence would be printed by supper as guilt. Emrys reached the edge of the circle. Sir Vernon, he said, let me see the receipt. Lydia's eyes moved to him then, not because he had spoken, but because of what he had chosen to ask first. The receipt. Not whether she had taken anything. Not whether she was well. Not whether the accusation was a lie. The receipt. Procedure before belief. It was not condemnation. That was the pain of it. It was caution, and caution had seated itself beside her enemies. Vernon handed the paper over with visible satisfaction. Emrys examined it. His face revealed little, but Lydia saw the moment he noticed something imperfect. A date, perhaps. A signature. Not enough. Not yet. He looked from the paper to her, and in that suspended breath, she understood that he would prevent the crowd from tearing her apart, but he would not yet stand before them and say he believed her without reservation. The vestry returned in another shape. Lady Lydia, he said carefully, no conclusion should be drawn until this document is examined. Letitia sighed as if grateful for fairness. Vernon inclined his head. The crowd relaxed into the delicious safety of postponed judgment. Lydia folded her hands before her reticule. Beneath the linen inside, The cracked token waited like a heart that had survived too much handling. "No conclusion," she repeated. Emrys's jaw tightened. He heard the wound. Hearing did not heal it. "That is prudent," he said. "Prudence," Lydia answered, "is often praised by those not currently bleeding from it." A ripple went through the ladies. Duchess Agnes's eyes sharpened from across the path. Lydia turned away from Emrys and faced the table. "You say I stole a token from a widow, Sir Vernon. I say a token entrusted to parish officers appears to have found its way into your hands. One token, that is sufficient cause for concern." Lydia looked at the almshouse model with its painted roof and spotless miniature rooms. Then she looked at Mrs. Pike, who had half risen from her chair. The widow's face was grey with fear. One step, Lydia thought. Only one. But Mrs. Pike's courage faltered beneath the weight of bonnets, titles, officers, and old threats. She sank back down, her hands trembling in her lap. Lydia did not blame her. No one who had a roof to lose should be asked to spend it for another woman's reputation before she was ready. Lydia turned back to Sir Vernon. Her voice was soft enough that the circle leaned in. "If I stole one token, who stole the other two?" The churchyard fell silent, not polite silence, not the silence of people waiting for rank. A deeper thing, a crack through performance. Letitia's fan stopped halfway open. Vernon's eyes narrowed before he remembered to look offended. Reverend Marsh glanced helplessly toward the churchwarden, who had gone pale. Emrys lowered the receipt a fraction, his gaze fixed on Lydia with a force that would once have unsettled her. Now it only confirmed that he understood the question had changed the room. Lydia did not draw the cracked token from her reticule. She would not let them turn Aunt Aurelia's last mark into a spectacle on their terms. "There were 3 names on the board," she said. "Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Bell. There are 3 gaps on the Thorn-lee token string. There were 3 rooms promised by a woman now dead, and 3 widows made to vanish from records. If you wish to call one token theft, then tell this parish what name you give the disappearance of 2 more." No one answered. The absence of answer became its own testimony. Letitia recovered first. "My dear Lady Lydia, you are overwrought." "No, I am precise." She curtsied to the rector, to Duchess Agnes, and last to the Duke. Her gaze met Emrys's only for a moment. In his eyes, she saw regret arriving too late to be useful. "Your Grace." He took one step as if to speak. She did not wait for it. She had given them her question. She would not give them the pleasure of watching what it cost. Mrs. Vale appeared beside her like a loyal shadow, and together they left the fete by the church path, passing the painted almshouse model, the donation dish, and Mrs. Pike's bowed head. At the lich gate, Lydia paused just long enough to breathe without anyone hearing it break. Behind her, the churchyard remained quiet. Ahead, the road to Thorn-lee lay damp and narrow beneath the trees. She walked toward it, with her reticule held close. The cracked token still hidden inside, not stolen, not surrendered, not yet displayed. By the time the Thorn-lee carriage reached the house that evening, Mrs. Vale was silent with fury, and Lydia's face ached from composure. No visitor followed, no apology came. Only near midnight, when the hall fire had burned low, a small bundle was left at the kitchen entrance, wrapped in brown cloth and tied with black thread. Mrs. Vale brought it to Lydia in the parlour. Inside lay a brass alms token, worn smooth at the edges, and a folded note in an unsteady hand. Mrs. Harrow kept the 3rd. I was afraid. Forgive me. Lydia closed her fingers around Mrs. Pike's token, and for the first time that day, the silence in Thorn-lee did not feel empty. It felt like someone gathering courage in the dark. Morning had not yet warmed the Thorn-lee windows when Lady Lydia Penrose placed the second alms token beside the first, and understood that courage often arrived after midnight, wrapped in brown cloth and trembling handwriting. Mrs. Pike's note lay open on the parlour table, its few words uneven but unmistakable. Mrs. Harrow kept the third. I was afraid. Forgive me. Lydia had read it so many times that the ink seemed to have entered her pulse. The cracked token bearing Aunt Aurelia's initials had been returned to the old token string after the fete, where it hung in the first gap. Mrs. Pike's token lay beside it now, not yet hung, because Lydia would not decide another woman's surrender for her. Mr. Fincham had taken a copy of the note at dawn and locked the original with the receipts, the vellum scrap, the printed notice, and the second threat. The pew rent board remained under cloth in the estate office. Nothing was safe. Everything was beginning to speak. Mrs. Vale brought in tea, then set it down untouched when wheels sounded on the gravel. She looked toward Lydia, His Grace. Lydia did not move at once. The memory of the church fete was still too fresh. Emrys Calder had not condemned her. That was the difficulty. If he had joined Sir Vernon openly, anger would have been simple. Instead, he had asked for the receipt. He had chosen caution in front of people eager to wound her. He had prevented a verdict without offering belief. The distinction was civilized. It was also painful. Show him into the morning room. Lydia said, Leave the door open. When she entered, Emrys stood beside the table rather than at the hearth, hat in hand, as if he had refused the comfort of appearing at home where he had not yet earned welcome. His face was drawn with a wakefulness that had not been kind to him. Lady Lydia, Your Grace. She did not offer her hand. He did not expect it. I came to apologize, he said. No preface, no courtly arrangement of phrases. The bluntness struck harder than elegance. Lydia crossed to the table and laid Mrs. Pike's copied note beside the wrapped second token. For which part? His eyes dropped to the note, then returned to her. For hesitating when I should have believed you, you asked for the receipt. Yes, a reasonable man would call that fairness. A frightened man calls it prudence. Lydia looked at him more closely. Frightened? The word did not belong easily to him. Dukes did not confess fear in morning rooms with housekeepers within hearing. They made others afraid and named it order. Emrys set his hat on the chair beside him. His bare hand rested on the back of it for a moment, then released. I feared scandal to House Caldermere. I feared discovering that parish officers under my family's patronage had permitted fraud. I feared that if I spoke too soon and lacked proof, the county would say I had been led by sentiment. His mouth tightened, and beneath all that, I feared being wrong in public again. Lydia felt something in her chest shift, but she did not soften her voice. So you allowed me to stand alone while you protected delay. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes, the word was quiet. It did not defend itself. You defended delay, not truth. I know. Outside a rook called from the wet beech trees. The sound was harsh enough to steady her. Lydia unfolded the linen around Mrs. Pike's token. The brass was darker than Aunt Aurelia's, its surface worn smooth, where fearful fingers had perhaps touched it in secret for years. Mrs. Pike sent this after midnight. Emrys did not reach for it. He looked at the token as if it deserved the respect a gentleman gave to a sworn statement. And Mrs. Harrow, sent to Canterbury, if Mrs. Pike is right, under another name. I can have riders inquire. Lydia's eyes lifted. He stopped at once, as though he had heard the command forming in his own mouth and refused it passage. No, he corrected himself. I can ask what you authorize. It was such a small alteration that no court would record it, yet in Lydia it touched the bruise left by many years of men deciding before asking. Mr. Fincham has already written to a charitable lodging in Canterbury, she said. You may send an inquiry to your agent there, but it must say Mrs. Harrow is not to be pressured, moved, or brought here without her consent. It will say exactly that, and the parish records. Reverend Marsh has agreed to open the vestry chest in my presence. Lydia's hand closed around Mrs. Pike's token. In your presence. Emrys heard the danger before she explained it. And yours, if you permit me to correct the arrangement. This is not a courtesy visit to records, Your Grace. If the folio shows that subscriptions were redirected, Caldermere patronage will look negligent at best. Yes, if the covenant proves that 3 widow rooms were endowed permanently, Sir Vernon's theft will not be the only scandal. The parish will ask how a duke's house failed to notice women displaced under its own church roof. Yes, she studied him. Do you understand what you are agreeing to? I am agreeing to be embarrassed by truth rather than honored by silence. The words left the room very quiet. Mrs. Vale, stationed near the open door with unnecessary mending in her hands, lowered her eyes. Lydia turned away first because she did not want him to see how near that answer came to the place where trust might begin. On the side table lay the vellum scrap from the almshouse wall panel. She had not shown him more than a glimpse when it was found. Now she took it up and placed it between them. This is all I have of the covenant so far. Emrys bent slightly, hands behind his back so there could be no question of possession. 3 rooms, permanent use. Widows of Thorn-lee Parish. Aunt Aurelia's small cross marked the corner. His jaw tightened. She knew. She marked the board as well, and someone cut away the rest, or hid it. Sir Vernon? Perhaps his clerk, perhaps the parish officer who signed false receipts. Perhaps someone still near enough to burn what remains if warned too early. Emrys straightened. Then what do you authorize? Lydia looked at the tokens, the note, the vellum. A week ago he had told her to know her place. Now he asked what she authorized in a house he could have overwhelmed by title alone. She did not mistake the beginning of humility for its completion. But neither did she refuse to recognize it. You may arrange that no parish record is moved without Mr. Fincham, Reverend Marsh, and me present. You may ensure Mrs. Pike suffers no loss of cottage or parish allowance because she gave testimony. You may send to Canterbury for information, not custody, and if this must be read before the parish, you will not stand in front of me. No, his voice was low. I will not. Even if Caldermere is shamed, especially then. Lydia felt the answer pass through the room like a door opening on cold air. She lifted Aunt Aurelia's cracked token from the string and brought it back to the table. For a moment she held it in her palm, remembering the vestry, the poor box table, the painted almshouse model, Mrs. Pike's bowed head. Then she extended it toward Emrys. He did not take it quickly. He opened his hand and waited. The gesture was so careful that it made her throat ache. She placed the cracked brass token in his palm. Its old metal looked small against the lines of his hand. My aunt carried this until she could no longer carry the fight, Lydia said. Mrs. Pike carried hers until fear became heavier than secrecy. Mrs. Harrow may still be carrying the third. Emrys looked down at the token. And you? Lydia rested her gloved hand over his, enclosing the token between them. The contact was deliberate, her choice. His hand remained still beneath hers, not trapping, not claiming. A silence formed around their joined hands, deeper than any the vestry had made, because this one did not humiliate. It listened. "I am carrying what they left," she said. Emrys's breath changed. "Only that." "I am afraid of what my house has permitted," he said. "I am more afraid of becoming the man who asks you to be silent." Lydia looked at him then, really looked, at the severity that had once cut her, at the restraint now holding itself in check under her hand, at the pride still there, but wounded by conscience instead of vanity. "Then do not ask." "I won't." In dialogue, the contract sounded almost startlingly human from him. Lydia's fingers stayed over his for one more breath, long enough for the token to warm between them. Long enough for both of them to know that something had changed, though neither would insult it by naming it too soon. Then she lifted her hand and took the token back. "Mr. Fincham will expect a written undertaking by noon. He shall have it, and Mrs. Harrow I will send to Canterbury within the hour. Information only. No pressure." Lydia nodded. The room returned slowly to its ordinary shape. Table, chairs, evidence, rain-bright window. A duke standing where command had once stood, now waiting to be told the next right thing. At the door he paused. "Lady Lydia, Your Grace. Yesterday at the fete when you asked who stole the other 2 tokens, I understood why the room went silent." "Why?" His gaze held hers. "Because every person there knew you had asked the question that should have been asked years ago." Lydia could not answer immediately. He bowed and left before gratitude could become another obligation between them. By late afternoon, his written undertaking arrived, precise and signed in full, followed by a second note from Fincham. A charitable lodging outside Canterbury had record of a Mrs. Hannah Reed, believed to be Mrs. Harrow under another name. She was alive. She would not return unless promised safety. Lydia read the line twice. Alive, afraid, waiting. She went to the parlour and rehung Aunt Aurelia's cracked token in the first gap. Beside it, she hung Mrs. Pike's token in the second, because Mrs. Pike had chosen to send it. 2 brass witnesses touched gently on the old string. The third place remained empty. Not absence now. Direction. The loose panel in the end almshouse room gave way with a sigh so soft that Lady Lydia Penrose almost thought the house had breathed out after holding its secret for 5 years. It was late in the 4th week since the vestry humiliation, and Thorn-lee's old charitable wing had become the centre of a quiet campaign no one in Caldermere parish yet understood. Mrs. Vale stood at the door with a lamp. Mr. Fincham waited near the cracked basin with his leather case open. Emrys Calder, Duke of Caldermere, remained just inside the threshold, close enough to help if the rotten boards shifted, far enough that Lydia did not feel crowded in a room already full of old grief. Dust silvered the air. The shutters of Mrs. Pike's promised end room had been pried open that morning, and a pale bar of spring light fell over the cold hearth where the torn vellum scrap had first been found. Lydia had returned because one phrase on that scrap would not leave her. 3 rooms, permanent use, widows of Thorn-lee parish. The torn edge had shown a faint line of paste, as if the piece had once been concealed inside something larger. Aunt Aurelia's small cross marked the corner, not as decoration, but as warning. Lydia pressed the lifted panel with her uninjured hand. The splinter cut from days earlier had healed enough to ache only when she curled her palm. But she remained careful. The wood shifted. Something inside slid, caught, then fell forward into her hand, wrapped in oilcloth so dry it crackled. Mrs. Vale whispered, "God preserve us." Fincham stepped closer. "Do not unfold it quickly, my lady. Vellum can crack if it has been damp and dried." Lydia held the packet as though it were a living thing. Emrys did not move. She noticed that first. Once, he would have taken charge of the discovery before asking whether he had permission to breathe near it. Now he waited, every line of him controlled. Lydia laid the oilcloth on the narrow bedstead frame and unwrapped it with Fincham's guidance. Inside lay a larger piece of vellum, torn along one side, written in brown ink that had faded but not failed. At the top, beneath the formal language, 3 names appeared in Aunt Aurelia's hand: Margaret Pike, Hannah Harrow, Eliza Bell. Lydia's throat closed, not from surprise, from the terrible relief of seeing women restored to letters before they could be restored to rooms. Fincham bent over the document, his spectacles low on his nose. This is not the entire covenant, but it is enough to establish intent. The missing edge would likely contain the parish counterpart reference. "Read it," Lydia said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Fincham traced a line without touching the ink. 3 rooms in the Thorn-lee almshouse wing are to be maintained for the permanent use of widows connected by service, tenancy, or parish, need to Thorn-lee and Caldermere parish. No room is to be sold, reassigned, or declared vacant without death, voluntary departure, or written consent before 2 witnesses. He paused. The room seemed to lean closer. And here, repairs to roof, hearth, glazing, and coal allowance are to be funded first from the Thorn-lee charitable rent charge, then supplemented by parish subscription when needed. Emrys spoke at last. Then the roof money was not charity alone. It was obligation. Fincham looked up. "Yes, Your Grace. And if money was collected for repairs never made, someone profited from neglect twice. First by withholding maintenance, then by recording false expenditure." Lydia reached for the bedpost, not because she would fall, but because anger needed somewhere to go. Mrs. Bell died paying rent after they told her she had no promised room. The words were quiet. They struck harder because they were quiet. Mrs. Vale's face crumpled, then set itself again with housekeeper's discipline. Emrys looked toward the nailed marks on the shutter where light had been kept out. "Your aunt tried to leave more than property." Lydia's fingers hovered over the 3 written names. She tried to leave shelter, and someone cut shelter into pieces. Sir Vernon's clerk collected tokens for correction, according to Mrs. Pike. Mrs. Harrow was sent away under another name. The token string at Thorn-lee was emptied. The board at the church was erased. The accounts were cut. Every place they had was made to look as if it had never existed. She looked at him then. "Do you understand? It was not one lie. It was a room, a pew, a token, a ledger, and a name all altered until truth had nowhere to stand." Emrys's expression changed, not with shock. Shock belonged to those who had never benefited from not seeing. What crossed his face was worse: recognition. "My family patronage made the parish listen to silence," he said. "I did not order this." "No." Lydia folded one edge of the oilcloth back from the vellum. "But people used your house's shadow." He accepted that without flinching. "Then they will answer in daylight." Fincham lifted the vellum gently. "There should be another half, the parish counterpart or a reference copy. If this was split, the missing side may be in the vestry chest, or already destroyed," Mrs. Vale said. "Not if Aunt Aurelia expected danger." Lydia looked around the end room, the paper-patched window, the narrow bedstead, the place Mrs. Pike had remembered for its morning light. She hid one half here because Thorn-lee was hers to guard. The other half may be where the lie was performed. "The parish chest," Emrys said. Lydia nodded. "But if Vernon learns we have this, he may move first." Emrys looked at Fincham. The chest must be watched. Lydia turned sharply. Not by your men without my authorization. He met the correction at once. No, by arrangement you approve. I spoke too quickly. The old ache of suspicion eased only a fraction, but it eased. Fincham closed his case. I can send a clerk to lodge with Reverend Marsh under the pretense of reviewing tithe abstracts. And I can instruct the rector, Emrys said, then checked himself. I can request that the rector admit Mr. Fincham's clerk and preserve the chest unopened until we are all present. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. That will do. It should have ended there, with strategy, proof, and the next movement of inquiry. Instead, the room betrayed her. The three names on the vellum blurred. Lydia had spent days moving from insult to evidence, from evidence to witness, from witness to danger, always forward, always useful. But now Aunt Aurelia's intention stood before her in ink, and with it came the image of an old woman, marking boards, hiding tokens, cutting crosses into wood, because she knew death might reach her before justice did. Lydia touched the side of the bedstead where Mrs. Pike should have woken to morning light. She knew, she said. My aunt knew they were taking the rooms. She must have known she was running out of time. Mrs. Vale stepped toward her, but stopped when Emrys did not. The Duke's face held such restraint that Lydia almost wished he would command something, because command could be refused. This was harder. He was waiting beside her grief, not managing it, not naming it for her, only standing near enough that she was not alone with it. Lady Lydia, he said softly, may I hold you? The question entered the room like a candle carried into a chapel. It did not demand. It did not presume that comfort was owed or welcome. Lydia closed her eyes for 1 second. In that darkness, she saw the vestry screen, the poor box table, Mrs. Pike's trembling hands, the 2 tokens on the Thorn-lee string, the third still somewhere with Mrs. Harrow, and the man before her who had wounded her because he thought rank gave him sight. Now, he asked. The difference mattered. She opened her eyes and stepped toward him. That was her answer. Emrys's arms came around her carefully, as though tenderness itself required discipline. Lydia rested her cheek against the dark wool of his coat for 1 breath, then another. He did not hold her tightly. He did not speak over the moment. His hand settled between her shoulder blades with a steadiness that allowed her to choose whether to remain. She did. The room was cold. The vellum was torn. The widows were still unrested. Yet for the first time since she had walked out of the vestry, Lydia let herself be tired where someone could see it. Not weak, not conquered. Tired. I'm not weeping for myself, she said against his coat, though her voice was rough enough to betray her. I know, he answered. I think that is why it hurts to witness. She almost laughed. It came out as a breath. You are becoming inconveniently perceptive, Your Grace. Too late in too many matters. His voice lowered, but not, I hope, too late in all. Lydia drew back before the words could become more than the room could bear. He released her immediately. That, too, mattered. Her eyes met his, close enough now to see the grief in him was not borrowed for effect. It had entered him and found fault lines. No kiss came, no declaration. The moment was not made smaller by restraint. If anything, restraint preserved it. Fincham, who had been examining the opposite wall with heroic concentration, cleared his throat only when Lydia turned back to the vellum. My lady, I shall prepare a protective wrapper. This must not remain here. It goes with you, Lydia said. A copied abstract stays with me. Mrs. Vale will record who has seen it. Very good. Footsteps sounded in the passage before Mrs. Vale could answer. A stable boy appeared at the door. cap twisted in both hands, eyes wide from running. "Begging pardon, my lady." A message from Mr. Fincham's clerk that went first to the house. He stopped, realizing Mr. Fincham was present, then thrust out a folded paper. Fincham took it and broke the seal. His expression tightened. "Mrs. Harrow has been found." Lydia gripped the bedpost again. Alive. Alive. At a charitable lodging outside Canterbury, under the name Hannah Reed, as suspected. He read further. "But she refuses to return unless promised safety in writing. She says the third token is not the only thing she kept." Emrys looked at Lydia. The air changed. The missing half of the covenant, the third token. A witness who had survived under another name. Lydia folded Aunt Aurelia's oilcloth over the recovered vellum with hands that no longer trembled. "Then we give her safety," she said, "and this time we put it in writing before anyone asks her to be brave." The message reached Thorn-lee at 4:30, when the sky had turned the color of pewter and every window in the old house seemed to hold its breath. A parish boy stood in the kitchen yard with mud up to his knees, cap crushed in both hands and fear making him forget his manners. Mrs. Vale brought him into the back passage herself, and Lady Lydia Penrose knew before he spoke that some part of the hidden truth had been touched by danger. "Smoke, my lady," the boy gasped, "by the vestry chimney. Reverend Marsh sent me, then told me not to run, so I ran." Lydia was already reaching for her bonnet. The recovered vellum half from the almshouse room was with Mr. Fincham, wrapped and guarded. Aunt Aurelia's cracked token and Mrs. Pike's token hung on the Thorn-lee string. The third remained with Mrs. Harrow, if the message from Canterbury was true, but the parish chest still held records no one had yet opened in Lydia's presence, and if smoke had found the vestry, then someone had chosen fire because ink had begun to speak. "Mrs. Vale, you will come with me. Send a groom to Mr. Fincham. Tell him the parish chest may be in danger. No one is to touch anything without witnesses." Mrs. Vale was already tying her cloak, and His Grace. Lydia paused only long enough to feel the weight of the question. Emrys Calder had asked what she authorized. She would answer in action, not uncertainty. "Send to Caldermere Park. Tell him I am going to the church, not alone and not secretly." The road to the village was slick from a sudden shower, and the carriage wheels threw wet grit against the panels. Lydia sat upright, one hand closed around nothing. It startled her, the absence of the token in her palm. Before she remembered, it was where it belonged for now, hanging in Thorn-lee's parlor with Mrs. Pike's witness beside it. Evidence had a place. Fear wanted her to clutch everything at once. Discipline required otherwise. Mrs. Vale watched her across the carriage. "They are burning papers, my lady. They are burning them because those papers matter." "Yes, that is not comfort." "No," Lydia said, "but it is direction." They reached the church as the first bitter thread of smoke slipped from the vestry chimney and drifted low across the churchyard stones. Reverend Marsh stood near the porch, pale and useless with alarm. The churchwarden wrung his hands beside him. A young clerk, Mr. Cray, whom Mrs. Pike had named as Sir Vernon's man, hovered by the vestry door, with a soot mark on his cuff and a face too carefully confused. "Old rubbish caught in the grate," he said before Lydia had even asked. "Nothing to alarm a lady." Lydia stepped past him. "Then you will not object to witnesses seeing it." The smell met her inside the vestry. It was not ordinary ash, not coal smoke, not the sour breath of damp kindling. It was sharper, older, and faintly sweet in the most terrible way. Vellum, singed paper, heated leather. Her stomach tightened. "The parish chest," she said. "Open it." Reverend Marsh stammered. Lady Lydia, the key is kept by the churchwarden, and this is hardly the moment for disorder. Disorder began when Smoke entered a locked room. Behind her, hoofbeats struck the lane. Emrys arrived before the carriage wheels had stopped outside the gate. He entered the vestry without hat or delay, saw Lydia, saw the smoke curling from the grate, saw Mr. Cray's cuff, and understood enough to become dangerously quiet. "Where is the chest key?" he asked. The churchwarden fumbled at his waistcoat. "Your Grace, I had it this morning. I am certain I had it." "Then the lock is opened or broken," Lydia said. Emrys looked at her, not at the rector, not at the men waiting to be instructed. "Do you authorize force?" The question, asked in a room full of authority, struck harder than any order could have. Lydia nodded once. "Yes. With Reverend Marsh, the churchwarden, Mrs. Vale, and me present. And Mr. Fincham when he arrives." "Very well." Emrys took the iron poker from beside the grate. He did not hand it to a servant, and he did not ask Lydia to step away, as if she were fragile. He moved to the old oak chest beneath the vestry shelves, tested the lock, then broke the hasp with one controlled strike, and a second that split the rusted plate from the wood. The chest opened with a groan. Smoke breathed out from inside. Mrs. Vale cried softly, but Lydia had already knelt beside the chest, handkerchief over her mouth. "Careful," Emrys said, then stopped as if the word itself might become command. "What do you need?" "Space." He gave it. Lydia reached into the chest and pulled free the top bundle, a stack of old notices charred at one corner. Beneath it lay a stitched parish account folio, its leather cover blackened along the edge, its pages smoking but not yet aflame. She lifted it with both hands. Heat bit through her gloves. Emrys seized the water jug from the rector's table and poured a careful line along the chest's inner edge, not over the folio, not over the ink. "The grate," Lydia said. Mrs. Vale moved first, using the hearth tongs to draw out a curling scrap that had fallen near the coals. It was not a full document, only a narrow slip already browned, bearing one visible word: Harrow. Lydia's breath caught. Not the third token, not the woman herself, a record of her. A place where her name had almost burned. Hooves and wheels sounded outside. Mr. Fincham arrived at the vestry door with his clerk behind him and took in the scene with one sweep of his eyes. "Lay the folio flat," he said. "Do not separate the pages until the heat leaves them." Lydia placed the stitched account folio on the rector's table. Its edges were singed but readable. A small packet, tucked between two sections, had been partly loosened by heat. Fincham used a paper knife to ease it free. Inside lay 3 paper rubbings of alms tokens, each labelled in a clerk's hand: Pike, Bell, Harrow. Lydia looked at the third rubbing, then at the burned slip from the grate. Mrs. Harrow still had the token. The parish had kept its shadow. "They were recording possession after they collected them," Fincham said grimly, "or pretending collection gave them authority." Mr. Cray backed toward the door. Emrys turned his head. "Mr. Cray, remain." The clerk froze. "Your Grace, I know nothing. I saw smoke and came to help." "You came before the rector sent for help," Lydia said. "Your cuff was marked before anyone entered the vestry." Cray's mouth opened, but another voice reached them from the porch. "What in God's name has happened here?" Sir Vernon Locksley strode in, breathless, polished, and too soon. His glance went first to the chest, then to the folio, then to Mr. Cray. Only after that did he arrange concern upon his face. "Lydia, my dear girl, you should not be in a smoky room. This is precisely the sort of excitement I feared." She stood with the singed harrow, slip in her hand. "How fortunate you arrived before anyone sent for you." Vernon's colour shifted. "The village is alarmed." Naturally I came. Naturally, Emrys said. The word held no warmth. Smoke thickened suddenly as wet ash hissed in the grate. Emrys coughed once, then again, turning aside as if to hide the weakness of breath. Instinct moved Lydia before thought could caution her. She touched his sleeve, light and brief, steadying rather than claiming. Step back, your grace. He looked down at her hand on his dark coat. For one suspended heartbeat, the burning vestry, the staring men, the rescued folio, and the old parish fear all seemed to recede. He did not cover her hand. He did not lean into the touch. He simply obeyed the care she had chosen to offer. As you decide, he said, roughened by smoke. Lydia withdrew her hand before the moment could be fed to gossip, but she did not regret it. Vernon saw. So did Mrs. Vale. So did Letitia's absent network, somehow already present in the future shape of whispers. Let them whisper, Lydia thought. There were worse things than being seen steadying a man who had learned to ask. Fincham tied a clean tape around the singed folio. This must leave the vestry under witness. Vernon stepped forward. Absolutely not. Parish property cannot be removed by a lady with a personal interest in discrediting officers. Emrys placed himself not before Lydia, but beside the table, leaving her visible. No paper will be moved, burned, copied, hidden, or restored to that chest without Lady Lydia Penrose and Mr. Fincham witnessing it. Reverend Marsh, you will record that order. The rector swallowed. Yes, your grace. Lydia looked at Emrys. He had used rank, not over her, around the evidence like a wall with a door she held open. It was not love, not yet, but it was learning made visible. Vernon's eyes flickered with calculation. You risk much for speculation. No, Lydia said, holding up the Harrow slip. Someone risked fire to prevent speculation from becoming proof. No one answered. Outside, the church bell gave a single dull movement in the wind. Not a ring, only a shift of old metal in its frame. Fincham gathered the rescued folio, the token rubbings, the burned Harrow slip, and the charred notices into a witnessed packet. Lydia signed the first record. Emrys signed beneath her, not above. That order did not go unnoticed. By the time Lydia returned to Thorn-lee, the sky had darkened, and her cloak smelled faintly of smoke. Mrs. Vale met her in the parlour, where Aunt Aurelia's cracked token and Mrs. Pike's token hung side by side, untouched. The third hook remained empty. Lydia looked at it and thought of Mrs. Harrow, alive under another name, still holding the last brass witness while men in the village tried to burn the paper ghost of her place. Near midnight, another note arrived from the same elegant slanted hand as before. It contained only one sentence. A lady who endangers a church to dramatize herself should not expect the parish to pity her twice. Lydia folded it once and placed it with the others. Letitia had chosen her Sunday accusation. Good, Lydia thought, looking toward the empty third hook. By Sunday, Mrs. Harrow might choose hers. On the Saturday evening before the parish was to hear the truth. Thorn-lee Court looked less like a house inherited than a house preparing to give evidence. In the morning room, the shutters were open to the last grey light, and every object on the long table had been placed with the severe care of a witness under oath. The pew-rent board lay wrapped in cloth at the far end, its erased names copied and witnessed. Beside it rested Fincham's abstract of the recovered vellum covenant, the original half now secured in his locked case. The singed parish account folio waited under clean linen, its charred edges still smelling faintly of smoke. The false vacancy notices lay flat beneath a paperweight. The subscription receipts, roof charges, copied token rubbings, printed slander notice, elegant threat, and Harrow slip from the vestry grate had each been numbered in Fincham's hand. Aunt Aurelia's cracked token and Mrs. Pike's token hung on the old Thorn-lee's string in the parlour, not on the evidence table, because Lydia would not move them again until Sunday morning. The third hook remained empty, but no longer hopelessly so. Mrs. Harrow arrived at Thorn-lee just after 6, carried not by Triumph, but by a hired chaise from Canterbury, with Fincham's clerk riding beside her and a written promise of safety folded inside her glove. She was thinner than Lydia expected, with cheeks hollowed by years of fear and a bonnet that had been brushed past its strength. When she stepped into the hall, she looked first at the doors, then at the stairs, then at the servants, measuring every possible exit before she allowed herself to breathe. Lydia went to her, but stopped at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Harrow, you are welcome here. You don't have to speak tonight unless you choose to." The old woman's eyes filled, though no tear fell. Miss Aurelia said the same sort of thing. She said a person isn't brave because someone commands it. Lydia's chest tightened. She was right. Mrs. Harrow opened her glove and placed a brass alms token in Lydia's palm. It was darker than the others, worn at the rim, and colder than the room. "I kept it under another name," she whispered. "They could take the room. They could take the pew. I wouldn't let them take the last proof that I had belonged somewhere." Lydia closed her fingers around the token only long enough to acknowledge its weight, then gave it back. "Tomorrow you may place it yourself if you wish." Mrs. Harrow stared at her. "You'd trust me with it still." "It was never mine to take." Across the hall, Emrys Calder stood near the open library door, watching without interrupting. He had brought Mrs. Harrow's written protection from Caldermere Park, signed in full and countersigned by Reverend Marsh, Mr. Fincham, and the churchwarden. He had not approached the old woman until Lydia asked him to witness her arrival. That restraint had become part of him in visible increments, and Lydia was beginning to fear how much she noticed each one. When Mrs. Harrow had been settled with tea beside Mrs. Vale, Emrys followed Lydia into the morning room, leaving the door wide open. "What do you want from me tomorrow?" he asked. The question came without ceremony. Lydia looked at the table of evidence, then at him. Not rescue, room. He absorbed it as if she had placed something fragile in his hands. "You shall have it. That means when Letitia smiles as if I am confused, you do not answer for me. When Sir Vernon produces a paper he hopes will frighten the parish, you do not seize the moment to become heroic. When Reverend Marsh hesitates, you may hold him to his duty, but the widows speak if they choose. Mr. Fincham reads, I answer, and I stand where the room cannot pretend I am alone." His face changed. It was a small thing, but Lydia saw the pain of understanding enter him. "That is where I should have stood at the fete. Yes, and in the vestry." She did not spare him. "Yes." He looked down at the singed folio, its blackened edge visible beneath the linen. "Lady Lydia, I am sorry for the words I used that day. Not because you have since proved yourself competent. You were owed respect before proof. I am sorry for telling you to know your place, as if rank gave me the right to assign it. I am sorry for caring more about the smoothness of the room than the truth of your warning. I am sorry I hesitated at the fete, because scandal to my house seemed, for one cowardly moment, heavier than injury to your name." Lydia had imagined apologies before. In girlhood, she had imagined them embroidered with regret and witnessed by those who had humiliated her. Later, she learned not to imagine them at all. This one was neither grand nor theatrical. It stood in an open doorway, with the smell of singed paper between them and did not ask to be rewarded. "You know an apology doesn't restore what happened," she said. "I know. It does not make me trust you entirely. It should not." That answer moved her more than any plea for forgiveness could have done. He drew a breath and kept his hands at his sides. "Tomorrow, if you still permit me, I will speak not as your duke, but as the man who loves what he has learned too late to deserve." The words entered the room and seemed to remain there, suspended, above the papers, too honest to be taken back and too restrained to demand a reply. Lydia's heart gave one hard, painful beat. Love had not been named fully, not yet. He had said the man who loves what he has learned. And in that careful phrasing, she heard both confession and waiting. He would not put the burden of answer on her before the public truth was repaired. She was grateful for that. She was also shaken by it. "Tomorrow is not for us," she said softly. "No. If there is anything to say after, it must stand on the other side of truth. Then I will wait on the other side." A step sounded in the hall, and Duchess Agnes Caldermere entered without sweeping announcement, her black silk gown severe, her face composed in the way great ladies wore concern when concern had been educated by consequence. She looked at the evidence table, then at her son, then at Lydia. "I am told this matter is to be raised after Sunday service." Emrys inclined his head. "It is." "Before the parish?" "Before those who heard the accusation and those whose rights were taken." The Duchess's mouth tightened. "Caldermere authority will be damaged." Lydia said nothing. It was not her place to soothe a duchess frightened by public truth. Emrys did not look at his mother when he answered. He looked at the singed folio. Caldermere authority was damaged when it failed to notice 3 widows being erased under its patronage. Duchess Agnes grew very still. "You understand what you risk?" "Yes. And for Lady Lydia." He turned then, not toward Lydia for permission, but toward his mother with the full weight of his choice. "For truth first. If I do it only for Lady Lydia, I make her another excuse for my pride." Silence followed. Duchess Agnes studied Lydia as if seeing, perhaps for the first time, not an inconvenient young woman from behind a vestry screen, but a person who had forced a great house to speak plainly. "Lady Letitia has been most active in expressing concern," the Duchess said at last. "Then tomorrow she may express it before the evidence," Lydia replied. The older woman's eyes sharpened. Then, very slowly, she inclined her head. "You are not easily moved from your course. I was moved from my chair once, Your Grace." It was instructive. For the briefest moment, something like unwilling admiration crossed Duchess Agnes's face. She turned to her son. "I shall attend." Then she left as quietly as she had entered. Emrys did not speak until her footsteps faded. "You have unsettled my mother. Your mother has survived Parliament dinners, ducal tenants, and fashionable daughters. I suspect she will endure me." A faint, tired warmth touched his expression. "I suspect she will remember you." Lydia looked back at the evidence table. "That will be enough for tomorrow." By candlelight, they finished the order of proof. The pew rent board would be carried by Emrys and Mr. Lobb after service. Lydia would carry the 3 tokens only if Mrs. Harrow chose to bring hers forward. Fincham would read the covenant. Reverend Marsh would open the vestry record. Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Bell's niece, and Mrs. Harrow would speak if willing. Every movement had a witness. Every paper had a place. Near midnight, after the household had quieted and the church across the fields was only a darker shape against the sky, Lydia stood alone in the parlour before the token string. She hung Mrs. Harrow's token in the 3rd gap only after the widow herself, wrapped in Mrs. Vale's shawl, nodded from the chair by the fire. 3 brass witnesses touched one another with the smallest sound. Lydia did not pray aloud. She only lifted the string carefully from its hook and wrapped it for morning. When the bells began on Sunday, she was already dressed. Thorn-lee's carriage waited. Fincham's case was strapped closed. Mrs. Harrow sat between Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Bell's niece. Pale but upright, Emrys stood outside beneath the grey dawn, holding one end of the wrapped pew board while Mr. Lobb held the other. He did not speak. He only looked at Lydia, and the question in his eyes was the one she had taught him to ask. She nodded. Together they walked toward the same church where she had once been told to know her place. By the time the last hymn faded, beneath the Caldermere church rafters, Lady Lydia Penrose knew that silence had a sound. It was in the pause before people rose from their pews. It was in the rustle of skirts that stopped when Reverend Marsh remained standing. It was in the way Sir Vernon Locksley turned his head toward the vestry door as if measuring distance to escape, and in the way Lady Letitia Arundel adjusted her gloves beside Duchess Agnes Caldermere, with a smile so composed that only fear could have polished it so finely. The church was full. Parish families, tenants, gentry, officers, servants permitted to linger near the rear, and widows who had once been treated as though their lives could be folded away with old accounts. Mrs. Pike sat near the aisle, trembling but upright. Mrs. Bell's niece held a handkerchief in both hands. Mrs. Harrow sat between them, thin and pale from years under another name, with the 3rd brass token hidden in her glove until she chose to reveal it. Lydia stood near the communion side table, not behind a screen, not beside the poor box, but in full view of the same parish that had heard her dismissed. Emrys Calder stood several feet to her left, not in front of her. Mr. Fincham waited beside the evidence case. Mr. Lobb and a footman carried the wrapped pew rent board to the front when Reverend Marsh, voice unsteady, said, "A matter concerning parish charity and the Thorn-lee almshouses must be addressed before the congregation disperses." Letitia rose at once, her expression all wounded grace. "Reverend, surely this is not the place for distressing speculation. Lady Lydia has suffered much agitation, and it would be cruel to encourage a public scene." Lydia looked at her. "Then let us avoid speculation." She nodded to Mr. Lobb. The cloth came away from the pew-rent board. A murmur passed through the church as the erased row faced the congregation. Fincham stepped forward with his copy. Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Bell. Their names remain visible beneath later varnish. Mr. Lobb, carpenter, has witnessed the removal marks, and the second set of nail holes showing the board was taken down after Miss Aurelia Penrose's death and rehung altered. Sir Vernon moved quickly. A damaged old board proves nothing except Lady Lydia's determination to make grief useful. The rooms were vacant. The notices state it clearly. He produced papers from his coat and held them high. Voluntary departure. Surrender of charitable place. Properly recorded. Mrs. Pike flinched. Lydia did not look away from Vernon. "Mrs. Pike, will you stand if you choose?" For a terrible moment the old woman could not move. Then Mrs. Harrow reached for her hand, and Mrs. Pike stood. Mrs. Bell's niece stood next. Last, Mrs. Harrow rose, opened her glove, and placed the 3rd brass arms token on the table with a sound so small that it seemed to break the room. Lydia placed Aunt Aurelia's cracked token beside it, then Mrs. Pike's. 3 brass witnesses lay in a line. "These were not surrendered," Lydia said. "They were hidden because the women who held them were frightened." Fincham opened the vellum abstract. The recovered covenant states that 3 rooms in the Thorn-lee almshouse wing were endowed for permanent use by widows connected to Thorn-lee and Caldermere parish. No room could be declared vacant without death, voluntary departure, or written consent before 2 witnesses. Forers. Vernon snapped. Fincham lifted another packet. The ink, hand, and estate references correspond with Miss Aurelia Penrose's confirmed papers. The parish folio, recovered from the vestry chest after an attempted burning, contains matching account references. Its edges are singed, but the entries remain readable. Emrys turned to Reverend Marsh. You witnessed the chest being opened after smoke was reported. The rector swallowed. I did. And Mr. Cray was present before help was summoned. Yes, Your Grace. At the rear, the clerk lowered his head. Fincham continued. Subscription money was collected for almshouse roof repairs. Receipts were issued for work never performed. One tradesman denies the signature. One named Thatcher was dead before the supposed payment. These approvals bear the name of Sir Vernon Locksley as advisor to the Thorn-lee interest. Vernon's face darkened. I relied on clerks, Mrs. Harrow spoke then, and her voice, though thin, carried through the nave. Your clerk took my token. You said if I stayed, my nephew would lose his cottage. Then I was sent to Canterbury as Hannah Reed. I kept the token because Miss Aurelia told me never to surrender all proof at once. Lady Letitia gave a soft gasp. This is painful, but old women may be mistaken when encouraged. Duchess Agnes turned her head slowly. Lydia saw Letitia's confidence falter beneath that ducal gaze. Fincham produced 3 folded notes. These letters, in Lady Letitia Arundel's hand, urge parish ladies to treat Lady Lydia's inquiry as theatrical grievance before any evidence was heard. One advises that a calm refusal to credit her will preserve the county from unpleasant reforming scenes. Letitia whitened. Private concern is not malice, Lydia answered at last. Concern that decides before listening is only contempt with softer gloves. The words found their mark. Letitia sat as if her knees had failed. Emrys stepped forward then, not to take Lydia's place, but to make the parish hold still for her. Lady Lydia will speak. No one interrupted. Lydia looked at the board, the tokens, the widows, and the church, where she had once been told to know her place. Thorn-lee will restore the 3 almshouse rooms. The roof will be repaired from the proper rent charge, and the parish accounts will be copied yearly for public inspection. Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Harrow, and Mrs. Bell's family will have their rights recorded by name, not hidden beneath pity. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. A place can be stolen without moving a stone. It can be stolen from a pew, a room, a ledger, a widow's name, or a woman's voice. Today it is returned. For a moment no one moved. Then Mrs. Pike began to cry silently, one hand pressed to her mouth. Mrs. Harrow touched the token she had kept for years, and Mrs. Bell's niece bowed her head over her handkerchief. Emrys turned to face the congregation. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. I told Lady Lydia to know her place because I mistook rank for judgment. Her place was never mine to assign. House Caldermere failed, as parish patron, by not seeing what Sir Vernon Locksley hid and what others made easy through silence. That failure ends here. The words struck the church harder than accusation. Sir Vernon tried once more to speak, but Duchess Agnes rose. Sir Vernon, you will resign every charitable and advisory trust connected to this parish before sunset. Mr. Fincham will begin recovery of misdirected funds. Until that matter is settled, you will not be received at Caldermere Park. Vernon looked to Letitia, but she had no help left to offer. Duchess Agnes's gaze moved to her. Lady Letitia Charity used as malice is not refinement. You will not act in my name again. The punishment was quiet. In that world, quiet punishment could close every door. Afterward, people did not applaud. The moment was too grave for that. They came forward in subdued clusters, some to apologize, some to stare, some to touch the pew board as if old wood had become scripture. Lydia remained until the widows were escorted safely to Thorn-lee's carriage. Only then did she step into the church porch, where the spring air moved cool against her face. Emrys followed, stopping where others could see them from the open door. "May I speak with you?" he asked. Lydia turned. "Yes." His composure trembled only in his eyes. "I love you, Lydia. I loved. First the courage I wounded, then the truth I could not command, and now the woman I would be honored to stand beside." The world seemed to narrow to stone, light, breath, and his voice saying her name without title or claim. Lydia felt the old caution rise, then soften, not vanish. She did not owe him love because he had done right. She loved him because he had learned to do right without asking to own the result. "I love you, Emrys," she said, "not because you are a duke, but because you learned to ask where once you ordered." He looked as if the words had struck him more deeply than any public disgrace could have done. "May I kiss you?" Lydia stepped closer of her own accord. Yes, the kiss was brief, restrained, and tender enough to make her eyes burn. His hand did not seize her. Hers rested lightly on his sleeve, the same sleeve she had touched in smoke, now steady in sunlight. Inside the church, the 3 tokens still lay on the table, no longer hidden, no longer stolen, no longer waiting for the room to believe they belonged. 3 months after the parish heard what had been hidden, the almshouse bell was carried back to Thorn-lee on a cart lined with clean straw, and every widow in Caldermere village came to watch it rise. It was not a grand bell. No cathedral would have envied it. Its bronze was plain, its rim slightly uneven, and its voice, when Mr. Lobb tested it in the yard, held a rough little crack that made Mrs. Harrow press both hands to her mouth and laugh through tears. Yet to Lydia Penrose, standing beneath the repaired eaves of the Thorn-lee almshouses, with the summer sun warm on her bonnet, it sounded more beautiful than any music ever performed for a ballroom. The roofs no longer leaked. The patched paper had been removed from the windows. Mrs. Pike's end room faced the church path exactly as she had remembered it, morning light lying across the sill like a promise finally kept. Mrs. Harrow had chosen the middle room because she said she had spent enough years under another name and now wished to hear footsteps on both sides of her. Mrs. Bell's niece, who had taken charge of her aunt's small keepsakes with solemn pride, had helped place a chair in the 3rd room for the next widow who would enter by right and not by favor. On the wall outside the rooms hung a neat public copy of the almshouse terms, written by Mr. Fincham and signed by Lydia, Reverend Marsh, the churchwarden, and Emrys Calder, Duke of Caldermere, as parish patron. A second copy of the annual accounts had been placed in the church porch, where any tenant, widow, parish officer, or curious lady with a talent for whispers might read it. The singed parish folio remained in Mr. Fincham's custody, its burned edge preserved rather than trimmed away, because Lydia had insisted that damage honestly shown taught more than damage polished out. Sir Vernon Locksley had resigned every trust before sunset, on the Sunday of the reckoning, as Duchess Agnes had commanded. By midsummer, he had entered a repayment agreement supervised by Fincham, and his name had disappeared from committees that had once welcomed him too readily. No one called it ruin aloud. They called it retirement, ill health, a necessary removal from public strain. Lydia called it consequence. Lady Letitia Arundel had gone to Bath under the care of an aunt who possessed both money and a talent for making disgrace sound like a change of air. Her letters to Duchess Agnes went unanswered. Her former place beside the Duchess in the front pew remained empty for 2 Sundays, then was quietly given to Mrs. Pike during the almshouse Thanksgiving service. No one applauded then either. Caldermere parish had learned that not every victory needed noise. Mrs. Vale stood near Lydia now, overseeing the bell rope as if it were a dinner service for royalty. "Not too high," she told Mr. Lobb. Widows should not need to stretch to summon help. "No, Mrs. Vale," the carpenter said, hiding a smile. Lydia turned away before Mrs. Vale could see her own smile, beyond the repaired path, where Thorn-lee land met the old churchway, and the beach line marked Caldermere Park. A rider dismounted and handed his reins to a groom. Emrys had come without ceremony, as he had done for weeks, always by daylight, always announced, always careful not to make Thorn-lee feel visited by its future master. It would never have one. That had been settled not in argument, but in a dozen choices. He asked before advising. He waited before entering. He sent documents through Fincham instead of household pressure. He received Mrs. Pike's opinions on roof slates with the gravity other men reserved for parliamentary reports. Most dangerously of all, he had learned to laugh softly when Lydia corrected him, not because he enjoyed being wrong, but because he no longer believed being corrected diminished him. He bowed to the widows first, then to Lydia. "The bell has returned." "It has," Lydia said, and with more dignity than many people manage. Mrs. Harrow, overhearing, said, "Bells don't pretend not to be cracked, Your Grace. That's why they ring honest." Emrys bowed to her. "Then we must all aspire to be bells, Mrs. Harrow." The old woman laughed outright, and the sound loosened something tender in the yard. When the bell was secured, Mrs. Harrow insisted on pulling the rope herself. The note that came out was uneven, bright, and brave. It travelled over the repaired roofs, across the church path, and into the fields, where haymakers paused and looked toward Thorn-lee. Mrs. Pike touched Lydia's sleeve. "Miss Aurelia would have heard that." Lydia swallowed. "I hope so." "No hope needed," Mrs. Pike said. "Some things carry." The small ceremony dispersed slowly. Fincham drew Reverend Marsh aside to discuss posted accounts. Mrs. Vale escorted the widows indoors for tea. Mr. Lobb began gathering tools with theatrical reluctance, lingering just long enough to be certain no lady's reputation was about to be endangered by privacy. Emrys noticed and looked faintly amused. Lydia noticed Emrys noticing and had to turn toward the church path to keep her composure. "Will you walk?" he asked. "Only if we remain in sight of half the parish, 3 widows, a housekeeper, and 1 carpenter with excellent hearing. I should feel poorly guarded with fewer." She accepted his arm. This time, she did not wait for a stile or a muddy place. She chose the gesture in open sunlight, and his arm steadied beneath her hand as it had once done on the lane outside Mrs. Pike's cottage. They walked toward the reopened path between Thorn-lee and the church, where the weeds had been cleared and gravel laid level enough for old feet. "I have something to ask," Emrys said. Lydia's fingers tightened lightly on his sleeve. "Then ask. You have become rather good at it." He stopped beneath the shade of the beech that stood neither wholly on Thorn-lee land nor wholly in the Duke's view, a border tree with roots uninterested in human rank. From his coat he took no ring box, no dramatic token, no symbol meant to dazzle witnesses, only a folded paper. Lydia looked at it, then at him. That is either very romantic or very legal. Both, if Fincham may be believed. She nearly laughed, but his face had gone serious. It is a proposed settlement clause, confirming that Thorn-lee remains under your stewardship and separate management unless you choose otherwise. Its accounts will not be absorbed into Caldermere's. Its almshouse obligations remain publicly posted. Its mistress remains herself. Lydia's breath caught before she could command it. He held the paper out, but did not press it into her hand. I love you, Lydia. I said it at the church porch, when the truth had only just been given room. I say it again now, after seeing what you do with room when it is yours. I would be honored if you would marry me. Not to complete Thorn-lee, not to quiet gossip, not to reward me for learning late, only because I wish to spend my life asking how to stand beside you, and being worthy of the answer. Lydia looked past him to the almshouse roofs, to Mrs. Harrow's bell rope, to the church, where tokens had once lain in proof, then back to the man who had first wounded her with rank, and later humbled that rank before every person who had heard it. Love did not erase memory. It changed what memory could become. Yes, she said. His eyes closed for one breath. When he opened them, the restraint in him had not vanished. It had filled with joy. Yes, yes, Emrys, I will marry you. She took the paper then, folded it once, and held it against her heart. But Thorn-lee remains Thorn-lee. His smile was quiet and complete, and Lydia remains Lydia. She gave him her hand. He bowed over it and kissed her gloved fingers, gentle as a vow made in public, but meant for the soul. Together they walked back toward the almshouses, hand in hand, not hiding and not performing. At the doorway, Mrs. Harrow beckoned Lydia inside and pointed to the new bell rope which hung within easy reach. Beneath it, on a small iron hook, Lydia fastened Aunt Aurelia's cracked brass arms token. The other two tokens had been returned to Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Harrow, where witness and memory belonged. Aunt Aurelia's remained at Thorn-lee, no longer hidden in a reticule, no longer clutched through humiliation, no longer needed as proof. It hung where anyone seeking help would see it and know. The bell answered. Mrs. Harrow pulled the rope once more. The bell rang over Thorn-lee, across Caldermere land, and down the church path that no one would close again. Lydia stood beside Emrys in the open doorway, her hand still in his, and listened until the last uneven note faded into summer light. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.